Broadcasting live from Youngville, North Carolina and Ontario, Canada, this is Gotmead Live, a weekly show where Vicky Rowe and AJ Aramits bring you the Mead news, meadery info, and mead-making discussions from all over, talking with mead makers, mead owners, industry mavens, and influencers. This is Gotmead Live, a weekly podcast about mead and the people who love it and where the mead world is going. And now here are your hosts, Gotmead owner Vicky Rowe and mead and wine maker AJ Aramits.
Live from the den of the Puppies of the Apocalypse, the Bunny Pen in Ottawa, Canada, Melbourne down under, Ryan's Pad in Denver, and the TARDIS in Miami. It's Gotmead Live. Welcome to the show. This week we've got Luke Holcombe from Scott Labs on with us, and the questions are piling up thick. I think Luke's probably going to run screaming after he's been on for about 20 minutes. We're going to bury the poor guy. Big subject here, and I think, given the interest that I've seen so far in this, we're going to have to get some of the other yeast folks on here as well. So, if it comes up to it and we can't get all the questions in tonight, we'll get Scott Labs back. And, and do this more than once. That is not a problem since yeast is, like a big dang deal. Anyway, we do all this on our own time and for free because we're awesome and all that stuff, but the software, hardware, and storage costs money. So we hope you'll consider becoming a supporting patron member. It's only $30 a year. You get access to the private patron forums on Gotmead.com as well as our patron group on Facebook. And there are award-winning recipes in the private patron forums, things that have won international medals. So $30 a year, 50 cents a week. Hey, we appreciate it, and we want to send a shout-out to all the folks that signed up in the last week, and the folks that continue to support us. Some of you have been supporting us for upwards of 15 years. You're the most awesome people ever. So thank you very much. If you want to listen live on the Gotmead website, just go put your mouse over Gotmead Live on the menu and click it, and you'll see our player, which plays whatever is most recent when we're not live and us live when we are. If you're mobile and want to do the download, catch us later, listen to us on your drive time and whatnot, you can find us on Spreaker, iTunes, SoundCloud, TuneIn, and Stitcher. Just search for Gotmead Live. We got replays all the way back to the beginning of the show. And you can, of course, also get them on Gotmead.com. Our player there will let you pull up everything all the way back to the beginning. If you want to find us online, of course, there's Gotmead.com. And you can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Gotmead. And our main group is facebook.com/groups/Gotmead. Twitter is at GotmeadNow. Feel free to tweet us. I'm usually watching the feed during the show. And of course, I'm watching it not during the show. If you want to email us, just go to Gotmead.com, put your mouse over Gotmead Live Radio Show. The drop-down will give you a link where you can click and send us a question or suggestion. We want to hear what you want to hear, so we'd like to know. And of course, during the show, assuming that Skype cooperates, which lately it's been really weird, you can call us at 803-443-MEAD. That's 803-443-6323. So, AJ, what you drinking?
Tonight, I've cracked open a bottle of Honey Run's Blackberry Honey Wine, and it is quite divine. I got it I brought it home last year from Mazer Cup, and it's been hanging in the wine rack ever since. It's been here long enough that it's dyed the bottle pink, and it's just very faintly pétillant, and it's everything I ever thought a blackberry mead should be. It's cool. 10 times better than my Blackberry Joe's Ancient Orange.
I use these kind of meads to give me a bar to shoot for. Whenever I have one that's better than anything I've ever made. There's a lot of them out there that are better than anything I've ever made. There's a lot of really good meads out there, both home and commercial. That mango last week, some guy named Ryan Carlson made that. It was really, really good. I'm drinking White Winter Winery's Blueberry Mead, which was actually one of my first very favorite meads, one of my first commercial meads ever. and to this date is still one of the meads I pull out for special occasions because it's been pulled out for multiple special occasions over the last 20 years. It's a nice straight up blueberry mead. It's not super fancy, but it's got this gorgeous light ruby color, lots of blueberry in the nose, and lots of honey. Just a hint of the earthy note you tend to get sometimes with blueberries. It's semi-sweet, lots of bright fruit notes, followed by the honey, a little acidity, and that slight earthy character in the flavor. I really like it, and it's really good with these See's candy truffles, curse you, Teresa Dorr, that I've gotten addicted to and have been allowing myself to have one of every day. But boy, you take a bite of truffle and just hold that in your mouth while you drink this blueberry mead over that. Divine. Just divine. So get your blueberry mead at whitewinter.com, and if you're in Wisconsin, they're near Iron River. Whoa, what was that? Somebody's got background something going on.
Don't think it's me.
Yeah, that's weird.
Oh, well.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe it's just...
Skype's being weird again.
Yeah, Skype does do that. We got ghosts in the machine. I don't know, weird. Anyway, what about you, Ryan? What are you drinking tonight? Yeah, I heard you mentioned something about mangoes and barrels.
Well, yeah. I was thinking about last week and how well you liked that mango that I gave you when we were at Mazer Cup, and so that was a batch that I made about 5 months ago, I think, and it was so well received, and we just gobbled it up that it was very short order that I made another batch. And I put it in I've got an American oak bourbon barrel, a 25-gallon barrel, and I made a batch and put it in there about a month before the Mazer Cup, and I hadn't tasted it for a long time. And so thinking about you and thinking about it last week, I thought I'm going to go try and see how that tastes in the barrel. And so I'm drinking that, and I'm just amazed at how good it is. I could fill up the bathtub and lay in it. It tastes so damn good.
Nice. Yeah, no, I want some of that, okay?
Sure, no problem.
All right, I'm getting Luke in now. We'll get him introduced to everybody.
Hello.
Hi, Luke. This is Vicky Rowe. Welcome to Gotmead Live.
Ah, awesome. Hello, everyone.
Yeah,
Hey,
you got me and AJ and Ryan.
Awesome.
Hi, Luke.
That's great. How are you guys doing?
Oh, pretty good.
Not
We were
bad.
just discussing how we're going to make you run screaming with all the questions that we have.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm welcome. I'm in flip-flops right now, so I don't think I can run very fast.
Oh, well, the zombies come, you're in trouble, but I think you're safe from us.
Have you ever seen the most prepared guy for the zombie apocalypse?
It would be the guy who knocks his friend down so he can get away.
Well, that works for bears too. But
Yeah, it
I've seen somebody where they line treadmills up all around their house.
That'll do it.
That would
Until they
depend.
fall off.
It would also depend on whether they're slow zombies or fast ones. If they're fast ones, that could be a problem, you know?
Yeah, to get the cardio in.
Yeah, right? We're really, really, really fit zombies.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, cool.
Goodness.
So, Luke, you
So,
were the one setting the table at the conference, right? For the
was me.
Scott Labs table? Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
So you've met all of us in person. Wah-ha.
Yeah. And he said
Yeah.
next to Rob all day long.
And I go to a lot of trade shows every year. The Mead trade show was one of my favorites. I put all of our propaganda out on the table at all these different trade shows.
Propaganda.
Most of the time, I ship a vast majority of it back. It was almost nothing to ship back this time. I was like, well, shoot, you guys took it all.
Yes.
It's great.
We're kind of into yeast in this crowd, so.
Yes, definitely. And so, by the way, thank you for having me on the podcast. I'm a huge podcast fan in general, and so this is my first one. So thank you.
Oh, cool. Oh, welcome. Yeah, if you get bored or you got drive time you need to fill up, we got stuff going back almost 2 years.
Oh yeah, well, so I live in Arkansas, and I'm sure you're familiar because you live in North Carolina.
Yep.
That mowing is an entire event season whatever you want to call it. I mean, people spool up for the season of mowing. So I get on my mower. I've got 4 acres to mow, and I just put my headphones in, and it's podcast after podcast after podcast.
Yep, same here.
Nice.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And everywhere you go takes a while. Are you out in
Yeah,
the,
that's
you
right.
out in the boonies in Arkansas? Because I'm like 30 minutes from a metro area, so like it takes a while to get anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, depends on what metric of standards you're comparing against. I suppose I'm somewhat rural.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm to say I'm not quite in BFE, but I can see BFE from here.
Yeah, I'm same way.
Yeah.
That adequately describes me as well. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm 5 minutes from Walmart, but I mean, if you're in the South, you're always 5 minutes from
I'm
Walmart.
gonna say I'm 10 minutes from a Food Lion, but it's Food Lion. They're everywhere. You know, food kitties.
In some
Food
places,
kitties
it's
are
the Piggly
everywhere.
Wiggly, right?
It is a lot like Piggly Wiggly, as a matter of fact. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm
Oh,
one of
that's
those.
great.
I'm one of those almost BFE rednecks where it's just, you know, if directions to your house include when you turn off the paved road, you might be a redneck. That's me.
Yeah.
hmm
Yeah. When you say, well, just send me the GPS, address, and people are like, no, that ain't gonna work.
Google, yeah, well, actually, Google found us about 2 or 3 years ago, so Google knows where we are now. But if I'm in my yard and like I map something, like say I'm going someplace in Virginia or whatever, so I go ahead and punch in the route, it wants me to go out the back to the neighborhood where the paved roads are because it can't believe that I'm in my yard and go to that road over there.
Right. Well, if Google knows where you are now, it's time to move, I think, huh?
Pretty much. I've been telling my husband that for a couple of years now. I'm looking for a piece of land where we can build a pole barn that I park the RV in.
Exactly. I do have a question for you guys.
What's that?
Does everyone have a glass of mead in front of them right now? Is that how this works?
Yes.
It is, and we want to
Most
know
certainly
what
is.
you're drinking, because that's important to know.
Well, yes, it is. It is important. So, it's 8 o'clock here, right? So I'm well within the appropriate range.
Yeah. That's right. You're in Central Time.
But I live in a mead wasteland.
Yes, you do.
I cannot even find one, right? So, and my background is winemaking, so I try to skew the national statistics of wine consumption. I'm carrying the burden for a lot of other people.
Somebody's
So
got
right
to
now
do
it's
it.
Montepulciano from Italy. So there you go.
Yeah. The puppies of the apocalypse heard something, so if you hear barking, that's what it is, and I apologize because it's just me around here.
No
There's
worries.
a meadery fixing to open in Arkansas.
I actually understood what you said there because you said fixin'. If you had used another word, I don't know if I would have.
Sorry.
That's
I've been
great,
in the
that's great.
South a long time, so I got more grits than oatmeal in my blood at this point. But yeah, I heard somebody's fixing to open a meadery down there, and I'm trying to remember who it was. I saw it. I got it
Well,
somewhere.
hopefully they're listening.
Yeah, I got it somewhere in my. I've got a list of fixing to opens that I keep track of, so that I can move them to the open list when
Yeah.
they get there. But I know I saw one because there's one in Arkansas, there's one in Mississippi, which blew my mind because it's another mead wasteland, and there was one in. I thought I heard there was one in Louisiana too.
Oh, I'm sure they're all over the place. I mean, it's
Well,
the bees
everywhere
are
else
everywhere.
they are, but in the South, it's been a struggle. South Carolina's got one with one fixing to open. North Carolina's got 4 now, which is pretty cool. Tennessee's got one fixing to. Florida's got 4 or 5 now. Georgia's got 3, 4, maybe 5 at this point. And it was Kentucky, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana were having the worst time with it because of the liquor laws.
Well, there's probably not a whole lot of legal meaderies, but I guarantee you there's mead being made. You know what I mean?
Well, that's a federal. You can make mead federal. Thanks to Jimmy Carter, we can do that. But yeah, there's actual legal meaderies that are in process. down there.
That's wonderful.
You will no
That's
longer
great.
be in a mead wasteland. It'll have an oasis somewhere.
Oh, I will seek it out. I will seek it out.
Yeah, you'll be my guy on the ground.
So,
Go
Luke,
give
I'm
us a
guessing
report.
since you're drinking wine.
Yeah, what are you drinking, Luke? Wine? Or did you get some mead?
Yeah, wine. Yeah.
Dude, you
When
were
are you going
at...
to start making your own mead?
Yeah.
I should. Most of my neighbors think that my shop is inside of it is some sort of, fermenting, heavenly, something going on there. Everyone thinks I'm running a bootleg. Well, I'm not, so I put away my commercial production hat a while ago, and honestly, I think smaller production, like home production, is actually harder and more difficult than large scale. So it's almost like I'm not interested until someone gives me a bunch of money to do it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I hear you. Well, and you're repping for Scott Labs over like what, a 10, 12, 15 state area? I saw a long list of states there.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's in the double digits. It may be in the 30 range.
Good Lord.
It kind of changes.
Yeah, so are
to
you
time,
ever
but,
even
yeah.
home, or do you just throw Mr. Wilson in the truck and go driving around?
Pretty much the latter. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I
Cool,
get
though.
it.
It's good life.
Puppies of the Apocalypse travel with me much of the time as well, so I get it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He had a really good day today, and he crashed out. So you won't hear much from him.
Yeah, well, the
Van
puppies
Helsing stays home and gets bunny sat.
and gets bunny sat. Yeah.
Yep.
Well,
He doesn't travel so.
If I took the POTPs with me to Colorado, I'm pretty sure I'd get in trouble. Can you see them running roughshod all over the hotel? That'd be terrifying.
Oh, that's great. So I gave you a few points of things that I was interested to talk about. Did you guys have other things or questions? Or,
Yes to both.
Yeah, good. All right.
So first, before we get into all the questions and stuff, tell the listeners out there a little bit about how you came to get into this, and just to give them a who's what kind of thing, and then we'll start talking yeast.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, that sounds great. So I grew up in the Central Valley of California. Please don't hold that against me. And I grew up in a town called Modesto, which there's a small winery, a little boutique family-owned winery called Gallo that is based in Modesto.
Never heard of them.
No, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know who they are, but we're trying to bring them to light, in the world, because they're a pretty good winery. Anyway, so the way it worked in California is Modesto was probably 250 to 300,000 people, and there were 5 high schools that you could attend. And the district that I was in was a high school that I probably might have gotten beat up, kind of a skinny dude, and so kind of a little bit ghetto. So I wanted to go to a different school. In order to do that, you had to find a program or a classroom, a set of classes that the district you were in did not offer. And so what this was plant and animal science and the SFA. So I said I wanted to go attend the SFA and get in plant and animal science, so that way I could go to this other high school. So I did that.
Nice.
And as part of the FFA, there's all sorts of judging teams that you can get on, right? Like, you can do the whole Napoleon Dynamite, and you can do the milk testing and, say that it tastes like a cow got into a patch of onions. You can do that. I ended up getting into...
I was in 4-H. We didn't have that.
You did? Okay. Well, it's out there. So I got into grapevine judging.
Oh.
So as part of that, you go up. Basically, how it works is you learn kind of the physiology of grapevines and what makes a good grapevine versus a bad grapevine. And the judging competition is held once a year at Fresno State. And you go down there, there's the judge, a viticultural expert that's sitting in some vineyard row, and he's got 4 vines tagged, and you go up and you inspect them, you make your notes, and then what you do is you rank them, and you rank them 1 to 4, and then you give him reasons on why you have chosen this, right? So I have 0 experience in agriculture at this point, 0. Sophomore year, I did sophomore, junior, and senior year. Sophomore year, I think we did pretty good. We placed like third place as a team. Second year, this was my junior year, I think we took first place as a team, and then senior year, second place as a team, and I won the state competition as an individual. And so I was dead set on going into the military at this point, but my parents were not having it. So I was like, well, I guess I'll go to college, right? Like, whatever. And I did pretty well in high school. So I applied to Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, which is right there on the coast, and Fresno State. Fresno State had a very well-developed viticulture program that spans many decades. Cal Poly had a minor in viticulture.
Mm-hmm.
And I got into both, and this was, to date myself, this is a time when I would it was online at this point, the application process. And you'd fill out a sheet, 1 page, and you'd hit enter, and then you'd come back like 30 minutes later, and the next page would have loaded, right? So,
right, yeah.
That's, yeah. Okay,
yeah,
so
I remember those days, yeah.
Yeah. So I got into both, and it was either Fresno or San Luis Obispo. Well, it wasn't a very hard decision. So I ended up going to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and I did pomology, which is the study of deciduous fruit crops. So this is almonds and peaches and citrus and kiwis and grapes and on. And I specialized in grapevines and viticulture. Well, about my third or fourth year, they launched their wine and viticulture program as a major.
Okay.
And Dr. Bruce Zocklin, formerly of Virginia Tech, he's retired now, who literally wrote the book for winemaking. Literally wrote the book, Production Wine Analysis. I don't know if you guys have it or
I have seen the book, yes. I didn't know he was from VT. Bible. That's cool. That's my daughter's alma mater.
Yeah. He was there for many years and really helped propel that industry in Virginia. So he came out on a sabbatical and helped launch the program, taught advanced enology and wine sensory and analysis. And I was his TA. This would have been 2005. I was his TA for both those classes, and I took those 2 classes. So needless to say, I got an A in both of those classes.
Nice.
Then 2006, so, we, as winemakers, we look at everything from a vintage perspective, right? So it's not necessarily the year, it's the vintage. So 2005, I interned at a place called McManus Family Vineyards in Ripon, California, which is in the Central Valley. And at that time, they were somewhere around 30,000 tons a year. So it's a very, very large winery. And I interned there, and at that point, I realized, whoa, you mean to say that you can make money making alcohol? Like, that's what I'm going to do. So that shifted my focus into enology and farther away from viticulture. So 2006, Cal Poly launched their first student-made branded wine for Cal Poly. So it says Cal Poly on the label. And I have my name signature on the back of this bottle. I was selected by the faculty to be the winemaker along with another young lady named Catherine Allegra, who is still making wine to this day on the Central Coast. So, you see your diploma and you look at the cost of the diploma and you're like, man, that's a really expensive piece of paper. Well, I have like a few left. Some very, very, very expensive wine. Very expensive wine. So, got my degree. Went back to McManus as their assistant winemaker for a few vintages. Left there. Took some time off. Then moved to Arkansas to take the winemaking position at Post Family Vineyards. This was in 2010. They were about 70,000 cases when I started, which is that's a very large winery in the aggregate of wineries. And I was the winemaker there until 2015, the end of 2015. And by that time, we had doubled. So in 5.5 years, we went from 70,000 cases to about 140,000 cases, which is, exponential growth, right? That was a wild ride. And then I started with Scott Labs in 2016, so January 1. So that brings me to now, I suppose.
Cool. And you just decided to stay in Arkansas after being down there? Making wine. Arkansas is nice.
Yeah.
I mean, aside from it being a mead desert, it's it's a nice place, Arkansas.
It definitely is. I mean, other than July and August.
Well, yeah. I don't know. It's only July and August for you? I'm living in the wrong place. Y'all got it easy. Here it starts in, March and goes till November. It's ridiculous. We've been fortunate this year. It's still not stupidly hot, and it's, middle of April, and I'm stunned. It's going to...
Oh, come on. It's even gross here in July and August.
Yeah, but, I mean, we're talking stupidly hot weather and stupidly humid. It's
humid.
God. Yeah, totally humid. I got to go to New Orleans in July to sit on a panel, and it's I love New Orleans, but New Orleans in July? God, I don't know, man. My husband's like, you going to stick around and sightsee? I'm like, it's New Orleans in July. He's like, good point.
Scuttle from air conditioner to air conditioner?
Pretty much, yeah. I will make a point to go down and have chicory coffee and beignets, because New Orleans, and and I'll probably make sure that I hit a couple of good restaurants and get me some shrimp and grits while I'm down there, but that's about it. I'll probably hit the hotel, stay at the conference. I mean, it is Tales of the Cocktail after all. There'll be a lot of booze flowing, so why leave? So, But, all right, so let's talk yeast, which is probably one of our favorite subjects. And
all right.
You had given me a list of kind of more top view stuff, which is good, because we'll start getting down. Some of the questions I've got are super specific. So, so let's start with the more general stuff, where does Scott Labs coming from on, obviously guys are doing wine yeast, beer yeast, and dealing with the craft industry and all of that, but what's the current focus that Scott Labs has in terms of the craft industry, and not just beer and maybe cider, but is there any focus going to be happening in the direction of mead? And and if so, what do we have to look forward to? Because we're all kind of making do with yeast from other, that are really designed for other beverages.
We're all using everyone else's yeast. We'd like our own, please.
We'd like our own, please. Yeah, that would be really nice.
So it's just funny you mentioned that. So to explain a little bit about Scott Labs, we've been around for about 80 years. At this point, we're primarily a distribution company. So we find very well vetted and established high quality vendors that we then distribute nationally, and also South America to a certain extent, Central America, and Canada.
And Canada, yay!
Yeah. Yeah, there's the Scott Labs Canada for sure. And so our portfolio is ever expanding. We have so many SKUs that we have found it important to have product specialists. Okay, so there's no way for someone like myself to be an expert on every single thing that we sell. It's just not possible, right?
Yeah.
So we have product specialists to support people like me that are out in the field. And so when there's a question that is above and beyond my scope of knowledge or experience, then I call in the expert. So on that note, we have two handbooks of which were cannibalized voraciously like a pack of piranhas at the Mead conference.
Yeah, if I'd known you had those, I would have grabbed one, dude. I didn't even realize. That's what happens when you're running around.
Yeah,
I didn't get anything good except a little leftover honey.
Well, we can. If somebody wants one, please let me know. I'd be happy to hook them up.
Yeah, y'all hear that? Okay,
is,
I'll hook you up with Luke. I did, and I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Luke. I linked the 2017 product manual PDF. Is that the most recent one, or do you have a 2018 one?
2018 will come out in a couple of months.
Gotcha. Okay, so guys, the 2017 Scott Labs product manual is linked on the episode page for this episode. I went and tracked it down earlier, and it's already linked up there. So just go get that, and you can download it right from their website.
Yep, and then we also have the cider handbook. You probably linked the fermentation handbook, which is
I
more
did. I linked the
wine,
fermentation handbook. Yeah.
which is great. There's a lot of material in there that's phenomenal. The cider handbook is a little bit more focused to cider. However, in a lot of different ways, I feel like mead is more similar to cider than it is wine. So there's maybe
Depends
a little
on the
bit
mead,
more.
yeah.
Sure.
Okay, where is it? 2016, 2017?
Yeah, that should be the one.
I think that's the most recent one, at least according to your Facebook page.
Oh, we have a 2017-2018 cider handbook.
You do?
So that
Okay.
is on the website. It's ScottLab, SCOTTLAB.com. It's ScottLab singular. So
Yeah,
SCOTTLAB.
Scott Lab 2017, 2018 cider. I'll track it down and link it on the page, guys.
Cool.
All right, so Luke, sorry, go on with what you were saying. I'll track it down.
So
Wait,
we
please,
have,
can I jump in just for a second?
Absolutely.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm curious. I want to hear from your side of the fence, being a yeast representative. Why do you think that mead is closer to cider than winemaking?
Two primary reasons. Number one, apples and other fruits that are made into cider are functionally devoid of nutrients for the yeast. And
Right.
we all know that mead is the same way. So that's point number one. Grapes have significantly higher amounts of what we call YAN, which is short for yeast assimilable nitrogen. And then the second reason is the alcohol levels that mead is produced in are more similar a lot of times to cider. And of course, this is completely variable and a very generalized statement, right? So a typical alcohol percentage of a California wine is 5% to 15%. I would conjecture even higher than that. So the meads typically that I've seen are a little bit lower than that. And so the reason I make that correlation is alcohol is synergistically a stabilizing agent to an extent, right? So there's this sweet spot, depending on the pH and some other factors like tannins and those kind of things, where from about 12.7% to about let's start at 12. 12.5, 12.7. You start getting a lot of effect, antimicrobial effect of alcohol. You get up above 18.4, 18.6, and on, then you get almost shelf stability at that point. So when you start veering lower than that, the products, whether it's cider or mead or wine or beer or whatever, they're much more unstable. Okay, so that's why I kind of lump the mead in with the cider. And I'm by no means a mead expert, so I don't have any numbers to support, statistics to support that 75% of the mead out there is at 13%. I really don't have a handle on that. So you guys could correct me there and give me some better idea there.
Well, so I could give you an idea, and I feel like I know quite a lot of really outstanding mead makers across the entirety of the United States. And I would say that probably most of our meads are 12% and above. And I know a lot of people that, myself included, most of our meads start at 14% and go up to now a 4 to 5 mead, maybe 22 or 24%.
Sure.
And so,
especially as mango mead, which is dangerous. Make sure to ask Ryan if he gives you mead what the ABV on that is, because it could be, you could really regret it later.
So, and I'll be happy to hook you up with some mead. Incidentally, Luke, we can take care of that later.
Yeah.
But so I think that maybe maybe I could be wrong, because I'm certainly more familiar with what most of my friends make here in Denver. But like I said, I also have a lot of other friends, and I would say that by far the average is above 12% rather than below.
Well, that's good from a stability standpoint. And
right.
You guys have more control over that than, say, the wine industry does, right? Because the wine industry picks at a certain sugar level when they feel like the grapes are ripe, and that typically dictates the alcohol percentage. I mean, there's things you can ameliorate, you can capitalize, and all those kind of things.
Sure.
But the mead you can dilute to whatever's legal, and you can adjust it a little bit more. And I think this would dovetail into another point that is a particular, maybe a philosophical question that I have. So it's like, why do we ferment meads, to these 12, 13, 14%? And I guess where I'm going with that is from a perspective of a flavor and structure standpoint of meads. Mead by itself is kind of a delicate beverage, right? There's not a whole lot going on, and you do things to buffer that, right? You add, maybe ferment with apples, maybe ferment with spices, maybe you ferment with peppers, and you try to increase like the aromatic, or what I like to call like the matrix. So I guess where I'm going with that is, the more delicate the wine, I feel like the carrying capacity in terms of balance for alcohol is reduced.
Right.
So personally, my experience with a lot of meads that are at those 13, 12% is like the alcohol tends to overwhelm the matrix a lot of times. The ones that are co-fermented with other things and barrel aged and blended with other products and those kind of things, they tend to carry it a little bit better. But I think maybe this is something that we do because we've always done it that way, where we ferment to these higher alcohol levels. Because if you did want to potentially improve or adjust the balance of this expression of alcohol and the quote unquote hotness of the product, you get down below 10%. And at that point, you lose a lot of stability the alcohol brings to the table. So,
right.
I'm not being accusatory, but it's a thing.
Sure. And I think if you looked at that backwards, you're right. If we don't have a lot of honey in our product, certainly then we are kind of limited to where we can go ABV-wise before the alcohol does overpower your honey. But if you switch that around and go, okay, a higher ABV will allow me to include a stronger impression of my honey, and of course then all your other adjuncts that we make with all the different styles. It just seems to me that it gives us more freedom when we are in that higher range of ABV to add enough of some of the delicacies that are easily trampled upon to our mead. And so I think that, I don't know, for me it's pretty easy to make a 16% ABV mead and not have much heat at all. And I think part of that's because I have learned how to adjust my heat level with the alcohols with tannins from oak, obviously. And
sure.
Yeah, so I don't know. That's just kind of why I think that's a better range than the lower, usually what we call the session meads, which are like a beer ABV. Those are generally kind of lacking in mouth volume. They're kind of faint on aroma, and not a lot of room to have enough honey in there to have a good honey expression when you're talking of something under 8% ABV.
Sure. And they're super unstable. It's unless you're doing pasteurization or Velcorin or sterile filtration, you're more in the beer world, and they have shelf life.
That's the thing with mead, though. It really depends on what you're doing and how you're doing it. Because I've had a couple of things that have been like between 5 and 8% that I've forgotten about in the back of the shelf for like 10 years, and I popped one open a couple of weeks ago, and it was great. So I may just be lucky, but normally I tend to ferment stuff between 12 and 15% too. But the amount of alcohol taste you get from it often depends on how you did the fermentation. So if you fermented the wrong yeast at the wrong temperature, or if you let it shoot through too fast, or if you didn't feed it properly, any of those things, you can end up with a very alcoholic taste, even if you don't have that high of an ABV. And even if you do have a high ABV, there are things you can do to balance it. Like, I find making a very strong sweet wine or mead isn't very difficult because it's balanced off by the sweetness, but trying to make a dry one, that's the challenge.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Scott, sorry. I mean, Luke, I'm looking at Scott Labs and thinking, never mind. Luke, you had said that you wanted to talk about kind of more in a general way fermentation, health, and management, and I'm curious what you've got in that regard.
Well, one of the things that I love about the meat industry is I think you guys do a great job of disseminating information, and one of those is the staggered nutrient additions, which is a fantastic way to feed your yeast. Because for many reasons, mead does not have a lot of yeast assembled nitrogen in it, so you have to supplement it. If you're going to produce like consistent, high quality, commercially viable mead on a regular basis, I mean that's a personal opinion of myself and the fact that I'm a nutrient salesperson. So take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah, no prejudice or anything like that.
Yeah, no. But I mean there is science there, right? And the higher the potential ABV, the higher amounts of nutrients are required generally to get a fermentation all the way through to dryness. So nutrition starts in the yeast rehydration at that stage. So one of the things that we preach on a regular basis is the utilization of a rehydration nutrient. And the conversation gets a little bit complicated sometimes because you say, fermentation nutrients. So you're saying I can just use my fermented K in with the yeast and that's feeding the yeast. And like, well, no, actually fermented K in the yeast rehydration water is actually toxic to the yeast, right? So, and the reason for that is fermented K has exactly the diammonium phosphate, which is a salt, is toxic to that point. So that's where you want to use something like GoFerm or GoFerm Protect Evolution, a yeast rehydration nutrient that is devoid of diammonium phosphate. And primarily at that point, one of the biggest things that we're concerned with are the formation and supplementation of sterols. And sterols are an interesting compound that the yeast will take up and also produce in order to build up their cell wall. And what happens essentially is the sterols increase what we call cell wall fluidity. So think of sort of like elasticity to a certain extent, and maybe the opposite of brittle. Okay, so it bends instead of breaks. Okay, and this helps to resist the toxicity of alcohol towards the end of fermentation. And if I say much more than that, I'm it's outside of my expertise level, and I would point you to somebody that is a yeast physiologist like Dr. Nicola Hall, who's on staff at Scott Labs. So if you ever want to talk about sterols and cell wall fluidity and the toxicity of alcohol and how that works, I would point you to someone like that can explain that some more. So
what's his last name?
Start there. Nicola is her first name, Nichola, last name Hall, Hall.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and she's phenomenal.
She's
so,
listed on the website. Isn't
Yeah.
she?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so
Could you please-
she's a PhD in yeast physiology,
please-
right?
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you please, while we're talking about sterols, lipids are very close in that same family. Can you speak just a little bit about lipids and what they provide for the cell wall later on when they're bumping up against the higher ABV as well?
They're definitely going to help. Lipid formation and supplementation and that whole process and the production of them is not something I'm an expert on, so I would prefer to defer to somebody who is.
All right, thank you.
Because the last thing I want to do is get out there and say something that is incorrect and give people the wrong information, because that's not my wheelhouse. But
we'll get you to help recommend us a deep in the weeds scientist that we can drag in here, and Ryan will have a field day with him. So we'll bring back one of the geeks from Scott Labs as well. So not a problem.
Yeah, I'm a pretty hardcore geek, and you'll discover that further along in this conversation, because I want to talk about my favorite topic, which is dissolved oxygen, but we're not there yet. So,
cool.
But let's focus on yeast. So, proper feeding of the yeast is super important, and I think a lot of mead makers have a pretty good handle with the staggered nutrient addition. Very, very generally, I come from a very large-scale commercial making background, and so DAP was always part of my program, or Ferment K which has DAP in it. I have, for numerous reasons, not only aromatic potential, the aromatics that you get, but also for some of the byproducts that yeast can produce in the presence of DAP and how they react to DAP. I prefer like Ferment O, products like that do not have supplemented DAP. So the discussion there, I'll get to here in a second. What I primarily like to look at with rehydration is following the manufacturer's recommendations for not only the temperature of the water, the quality of the water, which would be not hard but soft water, no chlorine, and at the right temperature. And then from there, proper handling and process of atemperization and also acclimating the yeast to the fermentation conditions. So what this looks like, and I'm sure you all are aware, you got this yeast and the temperature of the water is like, let's say 103 degrees. The last thing you want to do is take that batch of yeast that you've mixed up that cost you, depending on your batch size, $100 or $50, it's expensive. You don't want to just toss it into your fermentation medium that may be at like 55 degrees. If you do that, you will kill a vast majority of the yeast, and you're going to set yourself up for failure. So as a yeast salesperson, if you have a stuck fermentation and all your yeast are dead, like, I'll sell you more yeast. But I would rather sell you yeast one time, right? So you make better product. And the deal with that is how you want to approach this. And this works on the commercial scale and also the home scale. So you get your yeast in a rehydration water, 103 degrees. What I like to do is you cut the volume in half. So let's say you have 10 gallons, you add 5 gallons of your fermentation medium. So then you have 15 gallons. And you let them experience the change in osmotic potential. You let them experience the change in pH, change in temperature, on and on, right? You get them acclimated. And so now you're at, the example, okay, so you're at 15 gallons. So you wait 20 to 30 minutes, Now you add 7.5 gallons. So now you're at 22.5 gallons in your yeast culture. And then you let that hang out for, a few more minutes, and then you add 11.5 gallons. So now you're at, losing track of my math, 34 gallons. And you keep doing that until you get to a point where your yeast culture that you're building up is within about 16 degrees Fahrenheit of your fermentation medium. Once you're within that range, it's pretty well safe to add. Is that what you guys typically do, and is that familiar?
Well, what
Absolutely.
what you find a lot in our in our part of the craft industry is there's a couple of schools. There's those that are huge on staggered nutrient additions, and they don't. And I've actually got a comment / question from Pete Bakalich. Did you meet Pete at the conference at Mazer Cup?
I'm sure I did. Yeah.
Yeah, he's the president of the Mazer Cup, and one of my and pretty much my bestie. He's my best bud. But what we've got is two different schools. There's those who are trying to to science their way to the best mead using staggered nutrient additions, using various balancing techniques, using different types of starters, using lots of different things. And then there's the ones who are like, I ain't using more chemicals in my mead, and so they look upon feeding their yeast as a chemical alteration and don't want to do that. And we've got kind of an uphill battle with some of them because they don't, convincing them that yeast need to be fed. You can't starve them. That's like, anything else. You don't feed it, it dies, so... or
at least it doesn't perform well.
Well, yeah, and starved yeast does horrible things. So one of the things that that Pete said, and I think this is actually a good place to bring this in, is he says, and I'm quoting here, because mead, honey must, is inherently nitrogen and vitamin deficient, nutrient treatment has become a rallying cry for the preponderance of modern mead makers. Everybody and their dog has a nutrient dosing, this is Pete's words, has a nutrient dosing strategy. I've seen spreadsheets that suggest supplementing YAN levels to 450 ppm or even higher. At these levels, it seems that we are exceeding usable, recommended, safe, and in certain specific nutrients, legal levels, thiamine. Mm-hmm. It seems that a lot of mead makers ignore the initial sugar content, turbidity, oxygen levels, pH, and the temperature of the must. In the context of the preceding items, can you speak to best practices sort of rule of thumb level for nutrient additions in mg per gallon given most YAN levels in honey must is at or below 60 ppm?
Sure. So this is a multi-level question, right?
Yeah, it is.
So
it's a Pete question.
And that's totally fine because let's break down a lot of those points. So pH, dissolved oxygen, yeast selection, which I don't think he mentioned. Maybe he did. I didn't catch it. We're going to look at temperature, right?
Yeah.
That's an important thing. Initial YAN, which let's just ignore it and say it's 0, okay, functionally. And then what capabilities you have and what you're wanting to do. So pH. So I've never made mead. Most of the pHs that I have worked at are anywhere between 2.9 and at the worst case, maybe 4.1, 4.2, which is logarithmically different. And understandably, one of the difficulties that mead bakers experience based on their calcium and potassium levels is drastic pH shifts throughout fermentation. So that typically doesn't happen with cider and especially wine. There is some pH shift, but you have that stacked against you. So, okay, pH, you're probably going to see a swing, and that is going to be a stressor on the yeast, okay? So when you start looking at how much nutrients you need to start looking at, well, how much stress are my yeast going to see? Okay, so pH likely is going to be a stressor. Okay, so maybe we need to add a +1 there. Okay, how about dissolved oxygen? It's funny. This is literally like they're going to put it on my tombstone. This is my jam. I love DO. So let's talk about the process. Gases are inversely soluble with temperature, right? This is why if you have an open bottle of Coca-Cola,
it goes flat.
If you actually drink Coca-Cola, but whatever, I'm not going to go there.
It's Coca-Cola. How long you been living in Arkansas, boy?
It's pop down here.
They call it pop down there? Sinful. It's soda.
Bottom line, it goes flat way faster if it's not in the fridge.
Yeah.
Exactly. So gases are inversely soluble with temperature. So in winemaking, we have reds and whites, and we handle them very differently. Reds we typically handle throughout the crushing and initial steps and through fermentation at relatively warmer temperatures. Whereas whites, we bring them in and we crush them up, we press them off, we take the juice, then we chill it down in order to condense the solids and then rack off the top. So why is this important? Well, because on the whites, we have the cold temperatures, which dissolves significantly more oxygen into that medium, and then that dissolved oxygen is therefore bioavailable for the yeast. Whereas with reds, because we're hot most of the time, we don't get a lot of dissolving of this oxygen and therefore available for the yeast, which they can use to build sterols. And this is why we supplement the fermentations of red wines with oxygen, among other things, but it's one of the reasons. So I guess what I'm saying there is if you plan to be in a very reductive environment, and by reductive I mean in the absence of oxygen, just know you're adding a stressor to the yeast. So yeast can operate in an anaerobic environment, and certainly towards the end of fermentation it becomes very anaerobic. But in the beginning, they love oxygen. It stimulates the fermentation. It helps build the cell walls. You have significantly higher populations and healthier populations of yeast. And I mean, this science goes back to the 80s. This is very well understood that in the presence of higher levels of dissolved oxygen, you have healthier yeast fermentations. Now, the flip side of that is this will be a quick tangent. If you say, okay, well, Luke said to add a bunch more oxygen to my mead before I pitch my yeast. Well, I'm sort of saying that, but I'm also saying it's bioavailable to the yeast. It's also bioavailable to everything else.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay, so take it. Just know that when you do that, there are aerobic bacteria and yeast that love to make your mead smell real bad, potentially to the point where it's undrinkable. So this is where it gets into like timely processing. So, you get your honey, you dilute it down, get your yeast in it as quickly as possible in an ideal world, because that'll help to minimize the effect of the storage endogenous microorganisms that are there in solution. So, okay, back to those things that are driving us to add nutrients. Okay, so DO, we covered that. Yeast selection. So
can we interrupt for a second?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Let me ask you this. When we're talking about something and I have some what I think are pertinent questions, should I try to get those handled while we're still there, or would you prefer me to shut up so that you can get through from A to B and then drop back and touch on some of these other issues?
Okay, so 2 points there. I can talk for hours and hours and hours. So
that's right with us.
Stop me.
So I'll just have to get him on another show and just go, "Hi, y'all, this is Luke," and then just shut up and let him go, and I can go do something else for a while he's in it.
I can do it.
So let me ask you this then. There's two. I've developed my own method based on Scott White's book that he wrote, but I've also read the Scott Labs laboratory handbook a million times. The reason you guys gave out so many this year is because I'm always telling people to go there, and this is what I refer to as the Bible.
It's all Ryan's fault.
I bet
It's all Ryan's fault.
Yeah, it is. I bet I've sold over 200 of those things for you this past year. So I like to shoot for 18 parts per million, and I actually dose with an O2 stone at pitch, at 12, and at 24 hours. And then recently I've thought that I might also add a last dosage at my 50% sugar break. In your laboratory handbook, it talks about dosing starting at the 1/3 break and dosing between that up to the half break. Number one is 18 the sweet spot. According to Scott's book, it is. I've also read that I could add my addition of O2 at pitch, and within an hour, the yeast have assimilated all of that, which is why then I give it another a 12 and a 24, so that I'm picking up the daughter cells that have been reproduced. And then I'm assuming by the time we get to the halfway mark, it's gone past the growth phase and on into a stationary phase, so we're not seeing much cell reproduction at that point. Could you speak to that? Is there an advantage to just waiting and giving a big dose at the half versus giving them smaller doses along the way? Number two, are we not increasing the rapidity, the speed factor in how fast the cells are reproducing by giving them O2 along the way? I'll stop there. And is 18 parts per million the target?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because I've literally asked every yeast physiologist and every scientist I've ever met, anybody with, like 2 letters or 3 letters after their name,
right.
what's the target dissolved oxygen level for yeast during fermentation?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a big question.
And it is a big question, and no one can answer it that I'm aware of. I'm sure somebody may be listening to this podcast that has those 3 letters or the 2 letters, and they're like, I know the answer. I'm like, okay, cool. You know the answer.
So can somebody please publish that with corroborating evidence? Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah.
The answer that I've gotten over and over and over again is basically you can't add too much.
Well, that works.
And so I think that's, keep it simple, stupid, right?
Yeah, right,
okay,
yeah.
Cool.
Why make it complicated if you just go oxygenate the crap out of that? The question, and I'm with Ryan on this, is until when? And does it vary on the yeast strain?
Yes. So two points there. So because gases are inversely soluble with temperature, if you have a very warm fermentation and you do only 1 dose of oxygen, relatively little amounts of that oxygen is going to stay dissolved and therefore bioavailable for the yeast. Whereas if you have a colder fermentation, you're able to entrain more oxygen that is going to be more available to the yeast. So I would say if it's a cold fermentation that you're running, probably 1 or 2 adds is probably, just fine. If it's a really hot fermentation that you're running for whatever reason, which I would generally recommend against, perhaps you want to do more frequent adds. Based on physics.
What constitutes cold versus hot? Where's that temperature breakover?
Well, that
varies per yeast, So are you saying that stay within the yeast suggested temperature range, or are you saying that that hot is over 70 degrees Fahrenheit? Sorry, I don't think in Celsius. I'm, not a scientist.
Yeah,
so,
neither do I.
Yeah.
How many nations use the Fahrenheit system? Well,
none of them except
you guys.
Yeah, that's it. We're the last ones. Yeah, I really wish they'd changed that over when we had the government shutdown. It would have been nice. But yeah, I mean, so
divided by 5 plus 30.
I mean, I've kind of operated for a long time on the 70 degrees bad and everything below that good, which for the yeast that I tend to use tends to be fairly good, fairly accurate. You don't want to use, most yeasts are not happy over 70. Now, though, we're seeing a trend in the meat industry of people fermenting at higher temperatures, both home and pro, and coming up with some really great results. So, I mean, that's a whole different can of worms. So, I mean, we could, again, go off on that particular tangent probably for a while. But for general purposes, is there kind of a stay below this to stay in the not hot area that you would say?
Yeah, so look at the Scott Labs handbook or whoever you're buying your yeast from. They'll have a recommended temperature range. And that is like, if you stay within that, that's going to like set you up for the most amount of success. The issue with hot fermentations, and if you're unable to control them, the yeast can actually die. Like it becomes a stressor. And a hotter the fermentation, back to our nutrient thing, would require more nutrients. So similarly, a super cold fermentation, and what I mean by super cold is in my 40s or 50s, is going to require more nutrition as well. Because at that point, it becomes a stressor. So, like yeast are like us. I like 72 degrees, 70 degrees. That's what I like. I'm most active, right? You get me really cold, I'm not as active. You get me really hot, I'm not as active either.
Yeah.
And so I either need more air conditioning or I need more clothes, depending on the temperature. So same thing. Like yeast are.
Y'all in Arkansas, that
creatures,
means
also...
under 70 is more clothes, right?
Yeah.
And over 90 is more air.
Exactly. This gets back. I cannot make a blanket recommendation based on the fact that everyone's using different yeasts, right? And everyone has different abilities or lack of abilities to control their fermentation, right? So I will dovetail that into what I consider a big sticking point for me in the industry, which is what temperature do you ferment at?
Yeah, that's a huge argument topic. That's right up there with that's right up there with to feed or not to feed in terms of the biggest argument questions in the mead world.
Well, I want to turn that entire topic on its head, and here's what I'll say about that. My experience has led me to believe that a temperature is irrelevant. It's more the rate of sugar depletion over time.
Okay.
So you can adjust your temperature up and down, very glycol chilling or heating the tank or, putting the tank out in the sun or whatever you do to control it. Yeah, whatever it is, right? Everyone has their own abilities or lack thereof. So generally what I like to recommend, or at least get people to think about, is like, rather than setting my temperature at 55, maybe I want to start looking at the curve. So how much sugar is depleted per unit time or per day? And if you wanted a very generic recommendation, based on my experience, which is, half philosophy and half science, but there's, tens of millions of gallons behind it, I would say less than a brick a day. Now, that becomes difficult.
You just said less than a brick a day?
Less than a brick a day.
That's preferred?
That's what he's saying is if on average, I think. Is that right?
Well, yeah, obviously towards the end of fermentation, that's going to be difficult to achieve, right? But in the beginning of the fermentation, that's going to be also hard to achieve because you're going to be doing 2, 3, 5, 10 bricks a day. Who knows, right? Depends on a lot of different factors. But in white wine making, the reason why we ferment cold is so we get that slow sugar depletion. We retain those aromatics. And one of the reasons we retain those aromatics is there's just less CO2 produced over per unit time that can liberate some of the volatile aromatics. So I take the approach of I want to go as slow as possible or reasonably, like a brick a day, in order to continually entrain or maintain those aromatics that I am producing, rather than ferment fast and drive them off. Now, again, this is very philosophical. I mean, And some people agree, some people don't. There's science that says that optimal aromatic production by many yeast strains is around 74 degrees. Okay. That's not my experience, and then that gets into the question of all the science that we have. Look at how the trials are set up and what they're doing. If it's a 500 mil lab scale fermentation in triplicate using a model wine or a model mead solution, I gotta question the validity of their results. I understand what they're doing and trying to minimize the variables and control things and looking at very specific things, but does that scale up? Does it apply to what we're doing? Should we completely change our production strategy based on some new science on a model wine solution at a lab scale? Because the fermentation kinetics at 500 mils on a lab scale are completely different than 50 gallons, 5 gallons, 500 gallons. At some point, and somewhere in the neighborhood of about 74,000 gallons, which, I don't know that there is a single mead maker on the face of the planet doing fermentation that big, but definitely wine and beer, you almost can't control the fermentation. There's almost no way to do it, just from a heat load perspective. So, that was a deep tangent, and I've almost forgot where I'm at. So I guess what I'm saying is, we should question why we're fermenting at 55, and is 55 the symptom or the solution?
I don't know. That's a good question.
I don't know either.
There's a whole lot of people out there who are either listening now or who are going to be listening, and I'm probably going to get lots of ugly emails about this. You messing with stuff, dude.
If you're having problems with your fermentation, then it's the symptom. If you're having a good and clean fermentation, then it's the solution.
Yeah.
And if your fermentation blasts through everything so fast that all the flavor goes out the airlock, decrease your temperature.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Well, and also decrease your DO and decrease your yan per day of food preparation.
Well, it's honestly, I think it's the temperature that's going to cause the most drive in, at least in all of the biological experimentation I did in my environmental engineering degree and process engineering and all that crap way back 20 years ago. It was the temperature that affected the rate of conversion more than anything, whether it was, to a point, of course, because too hot's too hot. But,
right.
Generally to increase your production of whatever it is, increase your temperature, because warmer is faster. And that's almost universal. But the thing is, with winemaking and mead making, faster isn't necessarily better.
Okay, so...
Well, and then...
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, real quick. Somebody that is doing small-scale mead production that doesn't have production constraints, like they need to turn the brew house faster because they got to get stuff out the door, they can play with this. But people that are under commercial constraints, maybe they need to bring that mead in, get it blended down, and they got to get it out the door and in the package, in 3 weeks, and that's going to dictate their temperature, and that's going to dictate their rate. So, there's other factors here that can come into play.
Yeah. So swinging back around for a second to what Pete was talking about. It sounds like, obviously temperature plays a role, and all the yeasts have temperature ranges in which they're most comfortable that are published by the yeast manufacturers. But Pete had brought it kind of back around to that a lot of mead makers ignore the initial sugar content, turbidity, oxygen levels, pH, and temperature, which we've just been talking about, are the must. So, in looking at that, is there any kind of rule of thumb levels for nutrient additions in milligrams per gallon, given that most yan levels in the honey are at or below 60 parts per million?
Sort of. Yeah, yeast selection is going to be a big part of that equation. So there are some yeast that, and this is published, like in the Scott Labs handbook, it'll say this has a relatively low nitrogen requirement, right? So they're more voracious or more more powerful yeast, so they don't need as much turbidity. Yeast are tactile creatures in that they like to hang out on stuff. Like picture your yeast wanting to ride a wave in your fermentation, and if you're super clarified, so if your turbidity is really low, they
little
can't surf
surfing
that wave.
yeast.
Right, exactly. So they like some turbidity, right?
Right.
Then, so recommended levels. I probably would recommend. The higher the initial bricks, the higher the potential alcohol, the higher you want to be. I hesitate to say it's 250 ppm or 350 ppm or 400 because you have to look at all of these other things: the pH, the yeast selection, temperature, initial YAM levels, turbidity. You have to consider all those things, and they're going to increase or decrease your relative needs for nitrogen. So, all that being said, I'm not gonna recommend a number. Does that make sense on why I wouldn't?
Yeah.
It's a nuanced conversation.
Sure. I think what probably the intent of that question is some of us have analyzers where we can measure. I mean, I can measure everything except turbidity. But there's only I would say less than 10% of all of the mead makers I know. And most of those are serious mead makers. Not a lot of people have analyzers at home. So
yeah, I don't.
Sure.
I think
yeah, Ryan, you're kind of an outlier there.
I know I'm a geek, and all of these things are important to me, and I totally understand that for other people, they could give a rat's ass about anything we're talking about tonight. I get that.
Yeah.
I don't know. I care about this
that,
stuff. I just don't want to put the money into the equipment. Not when I can call you and you'll tell me.
Right. So I guess we're trying to find. I don't know. You're probably, Luke, not familiar with a couple generic, and they actually work very nicely. But we've got a couple YAN calculators that seem to do a very nice job by and large. Although it does not seem like they equate to the same YAN figures that you guys in your handbook would tell us to use. And so I think that's a question for another time, why the TOSNA protocol that most of us employ, or at least refer to people that don't have analyzers to measure everything, because it's easy, it seems to work, and people have good results. But even with an analyzer, all of these different parts and pieces, all the fractions, make it very difficult to try to really nail something specifically. And I guess we were trying, I think Pete's question was, is there a generic answer that we could use that would cover most of the spectrum?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think I can probably answer it a little better, and I'll say it in two different ways. Number one, if philosophically you consider yeast nutrients, which by and large are not chemicals, they're derived from yeast.
Right.
If you are philosophically, diabolically opposed to it, then don't use them. Okay, it's fine. You're gonna have a harder time at it.
Be aware that it's an uphill battle at that point.
Yeah.
Well, that goes back to what everybody was doing 10 years ago. Just pitch and wait for 3 or 4 years before you could drink your stuff.
Yeah, well, and there are people who are willing to do that. And hey, I'm a big fan of make mead in a way that makes you happy. Pete says Pete's following along, and Pete says he was getting at the point that there is in fact no cookie cutter method that covers all batches, because it depends on the yeast, it depends on the temperature, so many variables that are taking place here. He has a follow-on question to this one, saying, what about nutrient utilization efficiency at changing pH levels?
Okay, so before I delve into that, the second point that I would make about adding nutrients is what sort of temperature control you actually have. So if you don't have any temperature control and you add a bunch of nutrients, those yeast could ferment up into the 103, 104, 105 degree area, and they're gonna die. Okay, so I'm not advocating for massive amounts of 450 ppm. That's not what I'm advocating for. It's a balance. That's where I'm at. You want something that is going to coincide with your ability to remove heat from the fermentation. So that's what I'd say to that. Now, different pH levels and the different utilizations of nutrition. It's a very specific area of yeast physiology and fermentation science. I think we're going to see that there's going to be way more research that goes into that because at the various pHs, you get significantly different amounts of all the things being produced, like the flavor components, the aromatic components, the utilization of yeast-soluble nitrogen, and which sugars they're consuming and what alcohol levels that they are producing. And so I'm punting on that one. That's a very, very difficult question that, we could probably get somebody smarter than me on to talk about it for 5 different hours. And I don't think, I'm not aware of an overwhelming body of research going into that specific question, so it's not very well understood. Again, there's somebody that has a doctorate, potentially listening to, or will eventually listen to this, is like, hey, I just published research about that. Why don't you know about it? Well, I just don't. So, extraordinarily good question, and it speaks to something that I think is super important because, look, if we could figure out that, at 3.3 pH, we get significantly higher levels of, 3-MMH or 3-MHA or, some desirable thiol as opposed to 3.5, well, then I think people would start shooting for 3.3 instead of 3.5. So I'm here. I think it's super.
Sorry about that. That's Pete Bakulich, who's the one that was sending in the questions. So he's coming in too because Pete studied at UC Davis in the analogy program. So the two of you, I'm sure, will be able, between the three of you, AJ and I can just sit back and take notes.
Yep.
So Pete, welcome. Meet Luke.
Yeah, fantastic. Great questions, and they're honestly, to a certain extent, above my head, and I don't want to tackle them and give wrong information.
Totally understandable. Thanks so much. This is great information. I'm just sitting here soaking it up like a sponge, so keep talking.
Yeah,
don't
seriously.
Say that. That's Pandora's box.
Oh, no. Yeah, don't worry, Luke. We will wring you dry. If not tonight, then on another night. Not a problem.
Okay.
All right, so I know Ryan had a bunch. Well, okay, you had several topics you wanted to go, so I'm going to let you get back on track with your stuff.
No. I mean, I have my dogmatic things I want to talk about, but I want to talk about what you guys want to talk about. So,
well, all of what you had
away.
in your list, Luke, was stuff that's important to us too. I mean, we are yeast rangers, man. I mean, we totally are interested in the stuff. We want to know everything there is to know about it. Why does it work the way it does? Why doesn't it work the way we want it to? How can we make it work better? And what can we do to make sure that it comes out great every single time? I mean, these are the questions that are the bane of the mead maker's existence. So all that stuff you're on your little list there, totally right on line.
Yeah, so honestly, fermentation, health, and management, which is kind of what we've been talking about for the last hour, I think we've covered the high points, like the tools for success to consistently make good product. I think we've hit the high points. Does that make sense? Like I think we can move on to maybe
we can
some other topics, unless you guys have specific questions.
Well, I think we could probably go on in fermentation management for days, as you pointed out. Pete actually gave me another one, and now he's here. He can probably go ahead and ask it himself. Pete, that
Sure.
The sequence of additions to active fermentation question. Did you want to dive into that?
Sure. And this steps away from actual yeast optimization additions as such as nutrient and such, and goes more to things that you can do during your fermentation to bring up the impact of the middle palate presence, weight in the glass. It kind of take out the parchmenty kind of pencil shaving characters that you get when wood is added, and it's the uptake of the aroma and character, and the tannin is too quick, and you get that parchmenty, papery kind of character. I'm talking about specific inactivated yeast, tannin additions, and starting after sulfite. Generally, what I've been given to understand is sulfite, about 8 hours. Let that go before you add any enzyme if you're making a fruit mead or making grape wine. A lot of folks in the mead making world are adding bentonite up front because by the end of fermentation you get a nice clear mead. But bentonite, as I understand it, can denature enzymes, so you have to give the enzymes time to act before you add bentonite. And if tannin in there, it can also denature the enzymes, so you have to time that addition as well. And so we've got people that are doing sulfite and enzymes and bentonite and tannins and some kind of an SIY like Twister Blanc or Optimum Blanc or whatever they're going to be using. And some of them are even going the active, like at the end with Noble S and finishing tannin. So is that an area that you speak to normally, or is that something that we should set aside for a better time?
Sure. I mean, we can definitely talk about all that because mead and similarly cider and to maybe a lesser extent white wines. We want to produce like a really flavorful, mouth-filling, tactilely impressive product, right? And so the deck is sort of stacked against us. And so this is why people like to age in oak, or they add other things like these SIYs, the tannins, maybe other fruits, spices, those things to help build that up, right? Because the mead doesn't have a whole lot of tannins to begin with, or textural compounds. So yeah, there is definitely like a staggering effect that you kind of need to look at. The bentonite is relatively, it's not super soluble, so once you put it in, and a vast majority of it is going to precipitate, and then you can add your enzymes, for example, because you're absolutely right. Bentonite can inactivate a lot of enzymes. So you definitely don't want to blend your enzymes in with your bentonite add, right? Similarly, enzymes are pretty powerful, and they don't have a lot of negative interaction with SO2, except when the SO2 is in really high concentrations. So you add your SO2, you wait a little bit, a lot of it gets bound up, it binds with color, it binds with flavor compounds, it binds with oxygen, and then it kind of lowers to a point where you go ahead and add your enzymes, and they're not going to be really affected by the SO2 at that point, which brings us to an interesting topic of SO2 management, right? Because again, I think this is, especially in the mead world, but all fermented beverages like cider and wine, there is this resistance to using SO2 for, I would say, largely philosophical reasons. Religious, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good term
jihad
for
against
it.
SO2.
Certainly, it generates as much anger as a religious argument does. So.
Well, so let's dive into that real quick because it's I think a very interesting topic. So, why do we want to minimize our usage of SO2? Where does it come from? Why are people on this topic? Well,
I guess they don't have a good grasp on what sulfur is.
Say that again. I didn't hear that.
I'm sorry. I guess they don't have a good grasp of what sulfur actually is, and the fact that the Romans were using it 2,000 years ago.
I know, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. That's
You know,
whenever.
Yeah, that yeast created and the fermenting.
Yeah, that's the frustration I get when people say, well, we've been making mead or wine or whatever for blah, blah, thousands of years, and nobody had to do it then. It's like, well, actually, yes, they were doing that.
They did.
Yeah. In fact, there
Yeah.
was an ongoing search for better stabilization methods so that wine, mead, whatever, could be transported without going sideways. You know, that's how we got port. You know,
Well, and that's how we got pasteurization.
yeah, you know, was the
Yeah.
search for stability. It was all of, was all because of that.
Well, and so I'm going to dovetail this and do a couple things. Number one, I think a lot of people are resistant, or the marketplace is resistant to SO2 because they say, I'm allergic to SO2. I'm allergic to sulfites, right? I'm
Yeah.
sure you've heard this.
Yeah, all the time. And hardly any proof
who's the
exists.
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
It's
you
extremely
can't be allergic to
rare for
something
people
that's not a
to
protein.
actually be allergic to it. Very rare.
Yes.
Yeah.
But what people a lot of times, I have to characterize this in winemaking just because this is my wheelhouse, but what people a lot of times say is like, well, I can't drink red wines because they give me a headache, and it's the sulfites. At the same time, they say that they can drink white wines. Most of the time, this is the dichotomy we see. So there's a couple problems with that. Number one, so white wines typically have higher levels of SO2 anyways. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense as to why they can drink white wines. Secondly, most red wines go through malolactic fermentations, and I would contend that there is some bacterial activity in meads as well. And what can happen is that these fermentations or decarbosylation reactions occur with indigenous microflora. They're not adding like a commercial strain of bacteria. And what happens is, and certain yeasts can do this as well, they can consume some of the amino acids that are available, and they will produce what we call biogenic amines. Biogenic amines are, the four most primary ones are histamine, tyramine, putrescine, and cadaverine. So histamine, do you think we have a reaction to histamine? I certainly think so.
Oh, yeah.
Uh-huh.
So I think this is how the correlation occurs, that they say, well, sulfites are bad because people are allergic to sulfites, and they're allergic to sulfites because they're in red wine. And when I'm saying, like, no, it's not the sulfites in red wine, it's the biogenic amines that are in there. They're not gonna kill you. You're just gonna have an allergic reaction to them.
Yeah.
So I think this is how it's gone through our industry, and I think this is why people are so adverse to using SO2. And look, yeast produce SO2. It's already in the product anyways.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And yet, that is still one of the biggest bones of contention in, well, any of the fermented product industries. But we're hearing it because as a group, we live in a space that is, behind the, overall level of awareness you see in the professional wine industry or the professional beer industry. Our professional mead makers get this because they have to work in bigger concepts and they got to take that stuff to market, so they have to be aware. But from the home side of things, we've got stuff that's all over the place. We've just recently managed to almost completely convince people to stop boiling their honey. Almost completely. There are still those who do
Right.
it. There's still a few people who do it. But, 10, 15 years ago, and Pete'll back me on this because we were together in the trenches fighting this, was stop boiling your honey. Dude, you're burning off all of the high-level aromatics that it has, and really flattening your meat out, And if people didn't want to believe that, it wasn't just me and him. It was lots of people that were saying that. But a lot more were going, no, the old recipes from the 40s say boil it for an hour and a half,
Well,
Yeah,
what they're doing there is they're pasteurizing, and they're killing a lot of the microorganisms that they're having an issue with.
Not in
So
honey,
I get
though.
why they're doing it.
Yeah, but honey
the
doesn't
same
have
reason-
a lot of that.
It's the same reason why beer was safe to drink when the water wasn't.
Yeah.
Because they boiled it.
Right.
Exactly.
But honey is honey is naturally resistant to most most of the kinds of things that you find in other fermented beverages. So that was a sort of at least for honey, a wives' tale that carried across from other fermented beverage areas, saying yes, but we have to do this because blah. And it's like, yeah, but honey, you can preserve dang near anything with honey, and you can put it on wounds and they'll heal faster. And honey's really good for that kind of thing.
To be fair, that's fine until you dilute it. And what are we doing when we're fermenting it? We're diluting it.
We are, yes.
Exactly.
But if you follow proper, Pete?
Yeah, proper sanitation, you should be fine.
Yeah.
And that circles back to why we would use SO2 in mead to begin with. It is because we're diluting it, and we are making it more susceptible to infections outside of the fermentation agent of yeast.
Exactly.
The different bacteria. There's, all kinds of other little microbes and microflora that can get in there and raise hell with your fermentation. And, the whole idea of using SO2 is to prevent that, especially in mead, because it's so susceptible. There are actual bacteria in the gut of the bee that are transferred to the honey as the nectar is transformed into honey during the drying and process in the comb itself, that translate into the mead and actually survive if they're not, eradicated.
Excellent.
Yeah,
point.
well, that dovetails to a great topic here, because if you look back in kind of antiquity, what they were doing with beverages, I think very generally we could maybe all agree, and you can disagree if you'd like, but these producers did not want to move their product around in their cellar, a lot. They wanted to do it one time, maybe two times. They just wanted to ferment it and let it sit, right? You kind of hear this a lot. And my conjecture is that they realized the more they moved these products around from container to container to container to container, they saw a degradation in product quality and spoilage occur. So there was some native SO2 produced during the fermentation. And if you maintain minimal handling, that SO2 is actually going to be somewhat effective from a stability standpoint. Very, very low, but somewhat. The more they moved it around, what happens is they pick up more dissolved oxygen, which binds up with that SO2. Okay, so fast forward to nowadays. People are filtering, they want shelf stability, they are clarifying their needs and their products and so on and so forth. And all the while they're picking up dissolved oxygen, which is depleting their SO2, whether they add it or not. And this is why people have so many problems during aging and then downstream in packaging, because they're picking up so much oxygen, it's chewing up the SO2, and that SO2 is no longer being antimicrobial. It's functioning primarily as an antioxidative entity. So where I'm going with that is, the more you move your mead, the more you move your product, the more DO you're going to pick up, and the less effective your SO2 is going to be. So if you're one of these people that wants to use less SO2, then you have to either do minimal movements with your mead, or you got to come up with something that removes the dissolved oxygen that you do pick up. And there's a few ways to do this. Number one, to increase your buffering capacity for dissolved oxygen. So this is using things like tannins or oak to create a larger tannin structure that buffers more of that dissolved oxygen. Okay, that's number one. Number two, you can age on your leaves or buy a specific inactivated yeast, something like our leaves longevity, and that will actually actively consume and sequester the dissolved oxygen. And then the third, and what I consider probably the easiest thing to do, and probably most effective, is you just use a sparging stone and an inert gas like nitrogen, and preferably nitrogen for a host of reasons, to molecularly rip out that dissolved oxygen. So if you rip it out before it has a chance to bind up with the SO2, then therefore your SO2 is going to persist as an antimicrobial. And this is where we get this bottle shock and this degradation in barrels and all these things that we see is we're picking up way too much dissolved oxygen. This is how we get browning. This is how we get, the proliferation of Acetobacter and VA and all these other things, because the bad guys, bad bacteria and yeast love DO, and they love to be in an environment where there's very little SO2. So again, they're going to put it on my tombstone. But I think if you want to produce a really high quality, consistent product, you really have to monitor and control your dissolved oxygen. And buying a sparging stone and ripping it down on a regular basis, I think will be one of the best things a mead maker, whether they're commercial or on the small scale, can do for their product quality.
I'm taking notes on that. I'm a paint can stirrer with a hand drill person to get oxygen into my mead. So I take great pleasure in standing over it with my glass of tea in one hand and my drill in the other, going on my meads.
Yeah. I'm afraid to let any of my drills near anything I'm fermenting because they're either full of Bondo dust or drywall dust.
Yeah.
No.
Mine isn't. So yeah. But I mean, that's the sparging stone is something I've thought about doing and never seemed to quite get one, So I'm gonna have to go ahead and just bite the bullet on that.
They're dirt cheap.
I know. It's like when I'm buying stuff, it always seems to fall off the list somehow. I'm not sure why.
Well, and if anybody wants to follow up, at a later date and wants even, more information about how to control dissolved oxygen and how to remove it and why it's so important to control and remove after fermentation, right? Because we spent 30 minutes talking about how important oxygen was for yeast health, right?
Uh-huh.
So
Right.
it's good on the front end, bad on the back end.
Yeah.
And the closer you get to packaging and the smaller containers that you put it in, it exacerbates the problem. So, yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell for me.
Is there a flip over point where, is this one of those, if you don't have advanced tools to measure, you're not really going to know where to stop adding and to start removing gases?
No. Nitrogen is functionally
I was really
insoluble.
hoping for a different answer,
so,
but okay.
no. But what I'm saying is you can totally do this without fancy instrumentation and measuring a bunch of stuff.
Okay.
Because you can't add too much nitrogen.
Okay.
It's insoluble, so it comes right out. So,
okay.
Generally speaking, at standard temperature and pressure, which means 1 atmosphere at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, dissolved oxygen can exist in the liquid at about 9 parts per million. And at 9 parts per million, if you're using high purity nitrogen from your welding supplier or whatever, please get food grade. It's important to get food grade. It takes 5 volume changes of that liquid in order to drive out that dissolved oxygen. So what does that mean? That means if you have 500 gallons of mead, you need to put through 2,500 gallons of gas. And that'll take your DO to basically 0. Now, if you're much colder than that, it's going to take more. If you're warmer than that, it's going to take less. But you just look up a solubility curve. It's pretty easy to figure out what you need to do. And this stuff is all online. If you just put, how many volume changes of nitrogen is needed to drop DO, Google it, you'll find it out there. So you don't need a dissolved oxygen meter necessarily. I think it's important to have one, but you don't necessarily need it. And the only thing you got to really worry about is pressurizing a container. But other than that, it's pretty simple. It's pretty easy.
This is where I know Pete's sitting back there muted and laughing at me because he knows I'm shitty at chemistry and physics. This is the part where I pick. I know, but you know how terrible I am with this stuff.
I'm just snickering.
Yeah, I was just snickering a little bit, yeah, but you're muted and doing it, which is nice, that you're not laughing right in my face, so.
Pete, do you have more questions?
No, actually, I'm just really soaking this in. the questions I was asking about, initial sugar, turbidity, oxygenation, and different levels of oxygenation during the fermentation, the initial bricks of the sugar that you're starting with, and temperature and pH. We're basically, because it goes right back to that first part of the question, because like I was saying, everybody and their dog has a staggered nutrient addition regimen. I just call it a nutrient treatment, and I do it depending on the batch because I've done it over the years, for about the past 40 years, and I know which batches need nutrients generally when. And science that's available now through Scott Lab's handbook, and I've been a fan of that all the way back to the early 2000s, has been a tremendous help. And then all of the Salomon products and the Software products and some of the other products, Scott Lab's own new products for Canon and some of the other additions that are available, it just makes this so much easier to work with and make the job a lot easier, and the end product is a lot more bold and big and beautiful. So to me, people said, well, you've got, your SNA here, and you do this, and you do this, and you do this at the 1/3, the 2/3, and the sugar breaks, and you dose here with this, and you dose here with that. I said, well, that's all well and good, but, every fermentation is different, depending on what kind of temperature control you have, depending on the yeast that you have, depending on how you're treating it. And you really have to just sit back and know the honey you're using, the yeast you're using, the yeast temperature range, the yeast nutrient additions, how it reacts itself, that specific yeast to oxygenation and pH changes, and, react accordingly, because you really have to be on top of it. My own opinion.
I agree. It's not a recipe.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a measurement and a scale. It just depends on what you're doing.
Well,
Which is where, call Scott Labs and say, this is what I want to do. These are my parameters. What should I do? And we'll give you some good recommendations on how to achieve that based on the variables, right?
Absolutely. I need a Scott Labs T-shirt and a hat so I can wear them around and tell people, because you guys have just been amazing. You guys have just been amazing over the years. I've spoken to, the people that I remember most are Rebecca, Brandy, Zach, meeting you at the show. And, I think Ruth was taking over the lab when I first started calling Scott Labs, and it was just like amazing information. I was the two people that I called the most were Scott Labs and Stavan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, from my perspective, was a commercial winemaker for like 14 years, and Scott Labs was always my first call. And so when the opportunity came to work for them, I said, well, yeah. So, I'm all about it. And then here I am on a Mead podcast. All my wildest dreams have come true.
I have a whole bunch of things.
Yeah, Ryan can keep you busy for a while, so
I've been sitting on my tongue all night, so I wouldn't talk too much.
All right, we better turn him loose before he explodes. We don't want that to happen. We like Ryan. Yeah.
So here's what I would like to do quickly, if we could, because I think that some of the questions we myself and some of the listeners might have would be answered if we maybe did like just a quick overview of the basics first. In your handbook, it talks about if we pitch at a certain, let's see, if our brix is under 1,100, we're supposed to pitch at 25 grams per hectoliter. That starts us out with a yeast population of 4 times 10 to the 6.
Mm-hmm.
My question is then, when yeast grows from that point to the point where they stop reproducing in a logarithmic fashion, what would the cell population be in a general? And I realize all of these are generalities, but where are we then at the cell population when it's goes into the stationary phase?
You need a microscope and a hemocytometer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we don't know. We don't know if it be 4 times 10 to the 25th, or
No, I don't know the number off the top of my head. What I would say is a lot of times people are shooting for 10 to the 8th, and I think you get there with the 2 pounds per thousand.
Okay. I found different replies based on different things. My next question is, how often in a Mead style must, and again, I understand we can only be speaking about generalities, so I won't put that parameter anymore, but how often do the yeast replicate?
That's going to be dependent upon temperature, yeast genetics, so what strain they are, and then also like what stressors they have, like so.
Sure.
They can.
Let's assume we're trying to follow all of the parameters that are clearly listed in your handbook.
I would have to get back to you on that. I asked how many times it replicates, but I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay. How do the yeast, when they're in? So I look at population in comparison to if you study how many animals, wild animals, can live on an acre of land per se, and each acre has different. We're talking about carrying capacity.
Right.
Do the yeast have an understanding of where their population has to stop, and is that based on volume, or is it based on gravity, or neither? How do they know when it's time to go out of the life phase and into the growth phase, and how do they know when it's time to stop the growth phase?
So what you're talking there is biomass. So when you add your yeast and they then start dividing and budding, and you have mother and daughter cells, at that point, that's all the biomass that's available, right? Like there's only so many cells. Now they're gonna make more cells, but the thing is, because they're budding, they're robbing the mother cell of some of their biomass. Okay.
Of course,
it's a functional equilibrium.
Yep. Go ahead.
So what happens? The mother cells eventually end up dying because they no longer are healthy anymore. They get old and they die. And so then the younger ones, this is why we supplement with nutrients because that biomass is finite and it's being shared, and those yeast die and they fall to the bottom, and this is why we have leaves, and then they go through autolysis, and then they rupture their cells, and then more of their biomass is now available back in solution. This is why, for example, you can have blooms of things in the bottle. So the fermentation is dead, right? Like it stops, you're dry, and then you put it in the bottle, and over time what happens is the cells will rupture and they will release the intracellular nutrients, and then some of the other microorganisms that aren't completely dead can now start using those, and then they bloom again, and then they die and they bloom again, and over and over it goes.
I understand.
Does that answer the question, or did I go off on a tangent?
Well, so that brings up, that's a segue to something. I don't know that it completely answered the question because you said you needed to check with somebody else. But I remember the very day that I realized, and I'd been making mead for a while, I remember the day that I realized that any one snapshot in your pitcher of must, 50% of those cells are daughter number one. And that just totally blew my mind away, because prior to understanding, let's call the mom is number one, and then we have daughter number one all the way down to daughter 20. Let's cut it off at that point. I know that mom, each time she replicates, she's got a scar on her cell wall. So her cell wall over time becomes calloused and is not very permeable anymore. And I also understand that daughter one can have more viable daughter cells than can daughter number 15. And so I always thought we were at a depleting biomass because of these daughter cell issues until one day, just out of the blue, I realized, well, wait a minute, half of everything that's made at any given time is a daughter number one. So that made it, a continuous propagation effect. And so here's the other question then in regards to that. We can pitch at a higher pitch rate or we can build a starter, and my thoughts are that building a starter is less effective on the viability of the yeast because we start falling into the daughter cell phenomena versus pitching a higher cell pitch rate to start with.
Yes, the answer is yes.
Is there an advantage to a proper or a higher pitch rate versus having a starter where now you're kind of running into a worn out biomass instead of a more viable biomass?
A pitched strain, inoculated strain of yeast that is fresh out of the package that you rehydrate, acclimate, and add to your must is going to be a more viable population and have more vitality than most of the time than a build because of what you mentioned there, as well as some of the issues with sanitation. Like, is that a pure culture? Is there any competition going on via other strains in there? Like, is there bacteria? There's a host of other issues that come along with building cultures, which was the way it was done for a long time. Don't get me wrong. It's totally viable. I think what happens nowadays, because of the luxury that we have of, you can buy a 500 gram pack of yeast and get it shipped overnight to you, and you can be fermenting in 24 hours. It just makes more sense for a lot of people to do that, because while we are, what'd you say, you're not yeast farmers, but like yeast rangers, you're yeast rangers, right? So I would say, like, do you want to get into building cell cultures and looking through a microscope and cell counting and measuring viability? Do you want to go there, or do you want to, or have you had issues with, volatile sulfur compounds, or have you had issues with spoilage? Have you had stuck fermentations? And what I would say is, if any of those three things you said yes to, you probably want to stick to the commercial strain and not try to do a build-up, because I think your life is just going to get a lot harder.
Yeah, and there are very few people
take it with
that
a grain of salt.
There are very few people that have the capability or the resources to get that deep into it, or the time. Because it is.
Especially on the home side.
Exactly, especially on the home side. So, except Ryan and a few others who are not afraid to go there. Pete has the tools too.
Yeah. Okay, so now I have a bunch of one-liners, if you will. I have a question. If we're looking at doing O2 additions early in the fermentation process with the intent to make the cell wall more vigorous in the end when they're bumping up against the high alcohol and the low pH and all of that, we're adding O2 to make the cell wall stronger, more fortified, for lack of a better term. But if we look at the handbook, it says that we can add the SYIs, and they will also add and give our yeast lipids to do the same thing. So why even do O2 additions at all if we can add them cell holes in the beginning? And is it the same thing that we're doing? Is it different?
No, so adding the SIYs, you're also getting, some other nutrients as well, and you're increasing the available nutrient pool for cell division. Whereas if you use oxygen additions, you are strictly encouraging the biological production of these sterols and the cell wall fluidity. So it's kind of the same, but it's not.
Right.
I would probably say you want to do both.
Yeah. There's a small rabbit hole that I want to go down for just a second.
Sure.
The sterols is something that I've read at length about in various things, all the way from AJEV to some of the different books published by UC Davis professors. I was talking to Dr. Dave Block, who's the chair of the Department of Enology and Viticulture at Davis, and I said, I was reading about ergosterol and its role in, a very important role in providing elasticity in the cell wall, for obviously for nutrient uptake and respiration and, ejection of waste materials and such, and maintaining alcohol or preventing alcohol toxicity in a manner of speaking until it reaches the level where it can. And he turned around and he looked at me and he said, ergosterol doesn't really play a significant role in cell wall elasticity. And I go, you're kidding me. He's like, nope, we've done fairly significant research on that. I go, well, what other sterols were that? And we got interrupted while we were talking. But, evidently, ergosterol or ergosterol, however you want to say it, is not a key player in producing cell wall elasticity. And, there's other players in there, too, like Brian was mentioning, squalene and some of the other, products that are going. Yeah, absolutely. So are there specific sterols that we're looking at, or is it just sterol in aggregate that we're looking at as far as, promoting cell wall elasticity? So,
sterols are kind of there's a few different ones, right? And I'm about to sneeze, so if I sneeze, that's what's going on. Sorry. They can have different effects, and it's not, sterols are not solely for membrane permeability. I mean, that's what I think most of us rest our laurels on. But I mean, they also have effects on volatile odor compounds and flavor compounds, depending on the presence of oxygen. There's a lot of different things that they do. We typically talk about cell wall fluidity, and I think one of the reasons we do that is because most of the time people have experienced duck fermentations, especially if they're making higher alcohol products. And so it's like a trigger word. If you have high alcohol, maybe you want to supplement with sterols to protect them against the toxic effects of alcohol. And I think that helps a vast majority, has a bigger effect, right? Like that's an easy thing that you can do, and it will help, and we know it does help. But science is always changing, right? So, he says that sterols don't have an effect on cell wall fluidity. Okay, well, you can go back and look at the literature, and there's 50 different studies that say it does. So then it's like, all right, so let's look at these studies and say, well, how are they applicable? How are they set up? What were their metrics for success? Or what was their hypothesis? And what you'll find is sometimes there's things in the research that is completely overlooked and make. And I'm not saying that this gentleman did. I'm just saying in general, they make leaps over some things to arrive at the conclusions, and it's like wait, but you didn't monitor your dissolved oxygen when you did your study, and we know that oxygen helps increase sterols. So if you didn't even monitor that parameter, how are you saying that sterols didn't have an effect on cell wall fluidity? Now that was a complete fabrication of facts there that I just gave you. But I'm just very hesitant there, is what I'm saying.
To be fair, we're speaking specifically about ergosterol or ergosterol.
Right.
About one sterol in particular. Because that's the one that I was throwing out at him. And that was, he was speaking to that in particular. So, yeah,
I would love to read that.
Yeah.
I'd love to see the
so,
study.
I haven't found it anywhere. When I find it, I'll let you know.
And then we can have an entire podcast on sterols.
Yes, we can. And I'll just sit here muted and let y'all just go to town. You know?
And when you say y'all, that ain't me. I'm going to get somebody else on that has a PhD.
That'd be all y'all. To use proper Southern, that'd be all y'all, because it's more than one, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah.
What we were just speaking about is a perfect segue to another question that I have, please. In the cider handbook, now let me go back a minute. I always thought that it was most important to control our temperatures at least during the growth phase, because my understanding is that it's during the growth phase when most of the flavor profile is developed. That's in the growth phase when the ester production takes place. So I would, in my way of concluding things, I would say to myself, all right, that's been the most important time to control the temperatures if you were going to say that any one time was more important than another. Although I just recently read in the cider handbook, it says that temp control is the most important at the end of the ferment when the ETO levels are at their highest. Now, my question is this because the yeast are actually closer to dying anyway? So are they less likely to have as much vigor? And I couldn't find the word I was looking for, but if they're old and worn out and the alcohol levels are wiping them out, they're not very strong to stand up against the bad stressors in their life. So are they more likely? Is this because they're closer to dying anyway, so they are less likely to have as much vigor, or is it because the cell walls are more capable of leakage due to the replicational effects of the budding daughters?
So what I would contend that one of the reasons why temperature control at the beginning of fermentation is so important is that's when the yeast are the most active, aka they're chewing up the most amount of sugar per unit time, thereby producing the most amount of heat. Okay,
and
so
that would then make more heat.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And then towards the end of fermentation, I spoke about 1 brick of sugar depletion per day is kind of what I was shot for with white wine. Towards the end of fermentation, right, I was no longer at 47 degrees. I was closer to 72 because you keep letting it warm up and warm up and warm up, so it continues that curve, right? So temperature control doesn't mean limiting, it's control. It could be allowing it to warm up towards the end when they are more less viable and are starting to want to quit and go home. So you want to give them a little warmth and let them warm up and finish on out. So, yeah, that's why I think that most people are talking about temperature control at various times in the fermentation.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that they're... So thank you for your answer, and I understood exactly what you said, I believe. Do you think, though, that it's at that stage when we're talking about permeability and let's call it leaky gut syndrome,
mm-hmm,
for a lack of a yeast terminology, are they wiped out because they're old and tired, or are they wiped out because they budded so much that they've got all this scar tissue on their cell membranes, and so it's also very permeable?
It's all of the above. Also the alcohol is quite high at that point. There's a depletion of nutrients at that point as well. And then to an even greater extent, if you look at if you have a stuck fermentation and you analyze the glucose and fructose level individually, you go beyond mm-hmm. bricks or specific gravity. You actually look how many mgs of glucose and fructose are in there. You will always find that fructose is in significantly higher amounts. And the reason for that is because it has to go through an additional intermediary step in order to consume the fructose. And we have to do the same thing. Glucose is super easy to use for all cells on Earth, but fructose is difficult. So that's why we have fructophilic yeast. that we use a lot of times for stuck fermentations for restarting them. So there's definitely complete stats against them. There's lack of a lot of healthy young, mother and daughter one generation yeast. The temperature is usually cooler at this point, so that's kind of a stressor. The alcohol's higher. There's very little nutrients, and there's a bunch of fructose, and there's less of their favorite glucose stuff. So life is hard. Life is hard.
Right.
It's a tough old yeast world out there.
Hard knock life.
I'm envisioning like, two different strains coming at each other, snapping their fingers like a West Side Story scene, Dating myself.
I'm picturing the old yeast wrapping themselves in blankets to stay warm.
That too, yeah. And they're looking for their surfboards, that too.
Little wine. Yeah, little yeasties on surfboards. Cowabunga!
And Luke, just for anecdotal purposes, there's a lot of craggy old mead makers out there that understand the idea of glucophilic and fructophilic to the point of where they will choose their yeast based on the fructophilic or glucophilic profile. If they're making a sweet mead, so the perception is sweeter even at a lower finishing brick, because of the fructose left in it. You get a distinctly sweeter kind of a lift at the end than you do with the glucose heavy mead. Yeah, I mean that's pretty well known in certain circles. For example, if you look at the nutrition fact labeling on that Coca-Cola that you're drinking, or you look at a sweet food product like a Twinkie or whatever, you'll always see fructose at the higher end, because by volume, fructose has a higher sweetness perceptibility index by volume. So let's say like 1 gram per liter fructose versus 1 gram per liter of glucose versus 1 gram per liter of sucrose. The fructose is going to taste significantly sweeter. So that's why people do it. There's one to put your...
Go ahead, Peter.
No, I was just saying that's one to put in your book of tricks.
Oh, yeah. Right. Thank you for that. When yeast reach a place where they tap out, how long typically will they live in the must before they die out?
I don't know. I would say it is dependent upon the container that they're in. So the greater amount of hydraulic stress on them, so the taller the container, the more pressure that they have from the feet of head is going to accelerate that. So big old wide short container, they're not going to have that leaky gut syndrome that you talked about and explode. The taller and skinnier the tank, the quicker that is going to occur.
Right.
It depends. That's my favorite answer. It depends.
I guess
that's
the
a good
reason
answer.
I
That
asked
depends.
we all hear of stories where people have used, they've stabilized and they've may or may have not done proper SO2 management, but they have a bottle bomb 3 years after they stabilized everything. My question is, was that the indigenous yeast, or I'm guessing, and I'm only guessing, that those were indigenous bacteria that eventually were able to grow to a point that they had fermentation. What's your thoughts on that?
So it could be. So we don't have monoculture in our products, right? So we say, well, I added a bunch of yeast. Well, yeah, but you still have whatever yeast was out there, plus whatever bacteria that the bee carried in its gut and put in the honey, and then it got diluted. And now it's active. What typically happens with a bloom is, in my experience, is that obviously it's not sterile filtered, right? And it's not pasteurized, so it's still relatively unstable product. What happens is there's some quantity of SO2 typically that they have like in the bottling tank, and then they bottle it. And on the small scale, vast majority of people are hand corking. And so they hand cork it and essentially pressurize the bottle with oxygen, which binds up with the vast majority of the SO2 that they did have. And so the molecular level of SO2 that persists as an antimicrobial is basically zero. And so eventually whatever else is in there scavenges enough nutrients from the other cells, and there's little to no SO2, and you get a bloom. That's typically what happens. So it's a whole bottle shock thing. That stuff was always there. So again, if you control your dissolved oxygen and you prevent bottle shock by doing vacuum corking or crown cap or screw cap or something that you're not literally pressurizing the bottle with oxygen, your SO2 is going to persist, and that's going to help you in the long run. The other thing is, I would always ask people that have this sort of thing. I said, have you used concentrate ever in your production? And most of the time they say yes, and that usually tells me, well, that's Zygosaccharomyces, because Zygosaccharomyces loves concentrate. And what happens is Zygo actually can produce what we call extracellular sulfide binding compounds. So let's say you did have SO2 in there and you did control your dissolved oxygen and you didn't have bottle shock. The Zygo, and I'm talking like 1 cell per bottle, you only need 1, can start slowly secreting these compounds that bind up the SO2, deplete it, and then once they've depleted it to a point where it's below any sort of like antimicrobial level, then they just have a party.
Yeah. Huh.
Scary stuff. Keep you up at night.
Yeah.
All right.
We've got, let me just jump in real quick here, Ryan, if you don't mind. Joe Lee's asking, he's curious about the yeast cleaning up after itself after fermentation is stopped and what that actually means. In addition, he heard something about overpitching leads to lazy yeast and that it doesn't clean up after itself.
Interesting. So I'd like to understand a little bit more about what he means by cleaning up after itself. But
that.
Yeah,
like
go
a
ahead.
diacetyl rest.
Go ahead.
Like in beer, they do a diacetyl rest. And so some people think that takes place if you allow like some short-term lees aging. In other words, you leave your must with the lees for a month after you stabilized, keep them in suspension, of course, but then they think that the yeast will do something where they're walking around, the ones that are alive. Let's say you went to 0, there's no more sugar left, but there's still a living biomass in there that they'll go around and chew up some of the stuff that they've created during the fermentation. And I've actually thought that there's a cleansing process that goes on more so by absorption rather than active assimilation, if that's the right terminology. So I think that's what the question is.
Yeah, I agree.
And wine
I
and
totally
mead.
agree.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
What was that, Pete?
I was just going to say, in wine and mead, any diacetyl contribution is going to be done through an MLF, and since mead doesn't have generally, because of the honey source, a preponderance of any kind of malic acid available, you're not going to get an MLF unless you're doing a sizer with a lot of malic acid available.
Yeah, the other thing is, so the SIY, significant activated yeast that we have, the Noblesse, the Regulus, the Optimum Red and Optimum White, and Lee's Longevity and on it Rescue and on, like they have different effects, and they do have a cleansing effect. So I guess where I'm going with that is, if your lees is clean and healthy and you had a good fermentation with no volatile sulfur compounds, no sluggish activity, no VA being produced, on and on and on, I think that yeast would be a good tool for like almost fining or sequestering.
Right.
So yes, I think, over pitching, one of the reasons maybe why it's not good at cleaning up after itself is because that fermentation progresses so quickly, the yeast do get stressed, and then they release a lot more hydrogen sulfide and other volatile sulfur compounds in the solution, and it doesn't clean up after itself because that stuff persists. Whereas, fermentation that has a very healthy population of yeast, you can keep it on those leaves for a long time, and it could get better. It releases manoproteins, it releases umami, it releases glutathione. It has a reducing effect, meaning it can actually sequester dissolved oxygen, so you get a better shelf life. I mean, there's a number of things that leaves can do that, I kind of wish, to a certain extent, winemakers and mead makers and folks like that use their leaves more as a tool.
I do.
Great tool. If it doesn't stink. If it stinks, rack off, right?
Yeah.
Right away you rack it off if it's stinking.
21, CY3079. They're all great for that.
Sure.
And Pete, you mentioned that a while back when we were talking, and you talked like at the end of a ferment, you could toss some CY3079 into the mix, and it would give it in effect the same flavor profiles and maybe mouth volume that you would get from extended leaves. But it wasn't the time to ask you about that. Can you tell us?
Well, what was that, Pete?
I'm sorry, D254?
That was actually D254, and that was after a conversation I had with Clayton Cohn about the fine fresh leaves protocol they used to use.
And how do you do that?
Okay,
you just touch. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So what Clayton Cohn was talking about there, how many years ago was that?
2002, 2004.
Okay. So, by the way, Clayton Cohn, amazing individual, may he rest in peace, just passed away, I think, this last week.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, he was an incredible person. But so 2002, 2003, we didn't have the breadth of SIYs that we have now. So What he was saying was D254, chop it up, add it to yeast fining. Well, now we have the commercial preparation of that available for you, so you don't have to necessarily buy the D254. So we have those tools in our toolbox now that maybe we didn't have back then. The yeast fining has been around for a long time. Now we're just more targeted with it, right? So we have, depending on the yeast strain and depending on how it's manufactured and handled, we know that we have different tools in our toolbox. For example, like Rescue is a specific inactivated yeast. I've seen it where you can lower your residual copper content significantly. So let's say you have hydrogen sulfide. Yeah, I mean, like from 1.4 to like 0.6 with one fining at 30 grams per hectoliter. It's significant. So that's phenomenal, right?
Yeah.
Also, you can do things like, if you have a stuck fermentation, you use a specific inactivated yeast that will sequester or absorb the toxic fatty acids that have been produced, and you rack off, and then you re-inoculate, and then you have a better chance to get a successful fermentation than if you didn't use that specific inactivated yeast to produce those toxic fatty acids. So there's a lot of different tools in the toolbox. We have SIYs that give you more mouthfeel. To further that even more, we found that manoproteins, which are derived from yeast, have a protective colloid effect. So in the wine world, you can use them to prevent tartrate crystals. So it's amazing what we're finding that these things can do. So and look, from a philosophical standpoint, you don't want to add chemicals. Okay, do you mind adding a dead yeast? I think
right.
I think most people would be like, yeah, that's kind of okay. And you can really have some pretty significant effects.
I have two more questions if nobody minds. So,
go for it, Ryan. Sorry.
In regards to esterification, and is that the correct word, in making of esters, and we could apply the same concept if we wanted to add or make more esters, or we could do the reverse to try to minimize the amount of esters made. My understanding is that this takes place during the growth phase. If we were to let's say we wanted to make more esters. Let's say we like the esters of K1B. If we wanted more, by slowing down the growth phase, maybe by lowering the temperature or lowering the amount of YAN that we provide, or cessation of O2 additions during that period of time, that would slow down the process of the growth phase coming to the stationary phase. In doing so, because we've elongated the time in minutes, would that create more esters? And or flip that around, if we tried to rush the growth phase, would that minimize ester production? Or is one ester equals one gravity of assimilation? So it doesn't matter if you go fast or slow, you still get the same ester based on a gravity point instead of a time frame.
No, I'm going to answer it anecdotally because I don't fully know the answer. But why do we like to ferment at cooler temperatures for more aromatic wines or more aromatic products?
So we're not blowing off the aromatics through CO2 production, right?
Or that, as well as controlling that growth phase where all those esters are produced by having lower temperatures, we prolong that metabolic cycle. So we have a bigger pool.
It's a time rate rather than. I'm sorry. Say that again, please.
So we prolong that growth phase. So they're in that growth phase. They're in that metabolic cycle for a longer period of time, thus increasing the pool of esters that we can then retain.
Right.
And I'm presuming that. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I'm just presuming that lowering the temperature is probably the least stressful way of doing this to your yeast, rather than lowering the YAN or the O2.
Yeah, with the caveat of if you're at 85 and you're like, they told me to lower my temperature, I'm going to go to 47, and you do it quick, that's going to stress them, right? So do it gradually. The other thing I would say from a nutrient standpoint, we're beginning to really understand that organic nutrients that are primarily amino acids, as opposed to DAP, typically have better aromatic production as opposed to products that have been fermented with DAP.
And is that because the DAP causes the temperature spikes and the increased activity, or is it because of some other factor not in what
more metabolic? Yeah, more metabolic. Yeah.
So one more, and then I think I'll stop, even though I have more. In regards to adding the tannins, you're clarifying and finishing tannins. If you wanted to do a bench trial prior to treating an entire, a 40-gallon batch of must, how long, if you were to add some of the finishing tannins, how long would it take to integrate to a place where you could feel like this is what my finished product will taste like? In other words, does that happen almost immediately, or does it take some polymerization and integration before it's kind of come around to full effect?
The bench trials are simply an indication of what you're going to get, right? Because there's just so many more variables that are going to happen in the production scale, right? So
Right.
how I typically run tannin trials is, we have, 14 tannins or so. We sell a kit where all these tannins are shelf stable and dissolved in like a 10% alcohol mixture. So you use a micropipette, and I line all the tannins up. I take the product that I want to manipulate, and I go through and I dose them at the exact same dose rate. So let's say 5 grams per liter. And you go through and within just swirl and taste, swirl and taste, swirl and taste, swirl and taste. And what you immediately do is you pick out like the 10 that you don't like. And then you look at the 4 that you do, and then you start dialing in your dose. And I find that generally speaking, it correlates to what you're going to get. And maybe that's confirmation bias, but I think to a large extent, what you see in the bench trial ramps up fairly well with tannins. Now, obviously, you can do things to completely mitigate that, right? So I had this really nice nuanced bench trial with the Radiance tannin. And I liked it, and then I added it to my Mead, and then I added 70 parts per million SO2. Why doesn't it taste like Radiance? Well, you did something else to cover it up, right? Now it just tastes like SO2. So, but very generally, I find it correlates pretty well.
I see. So you're saying that if we just buy the test kit and then do the titrations, that should be well enough to determine then how you would want to dose your entire batch, and you could just count on that and go for it?
That's what most people do, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Pete, you got you got more you want to add to this?
No, I think Luke's put out some great information there. It's anything else would just be purely selfish for me at this point. So
I think this is the start of. I think over time this is going to turn into a yeastapalooza. We're going to end up having to have many yeast episodes where we bring in the yeast cowboys to let us dig deep, because my brains are leaking out my ears right now. There's so much information in this thing. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's great stuff.
It is.
And I was talking to Luke brought up earlier that yeast produce SO2 during fermentation, and that's why we have to label our bottles if we have anything over 10 parts per million that sulfites have been added. Even if we didn't add them, they're just part of the natural fermentation product. But there's some Côte de Rhône strains that will produce up to 225 parts per million.
Wow.
So that's a really nice loophole if you want to make no sulfite added.
Yeah.
Yeah, never have to bother sulfiting it, right?
Yeah, right. Stabilization. I don't need no stinking stabilization. Yeah.
I'm not an autolyzed yeast. I'm an auto yeast.
An auto yeast.
Nice.
Yeah. It's a Ferrari yeast as opposed to like a Honda yeast.
Yeah.
Don't be knocking my Honda.
Yeah. Hey, sorry. Thought you were a Chevette girl.
Well, I am, but the daily driver's a Honda right now.
Okay. So yeah, Luke, I think you've given us a lot to chew on here, and and I don't think this is over yet. There will be subsequent episodes of this. We could probably keep going for hours, and we're gonna totally be beating on Ryan about golly, Ryan, 2.5 hours.
Yeah,
Ryan gets up in our crap about it.
I think this one ran even longer than my last one, right?
Yeah. Whenever we bring you in, Pete, this is when it gets out of control. I think that's what it is. We should bring you in more often.
I can't help it.
Yeah, no, we like it. Hey, no complaints here. I don't get to see you on the show often enough, my friend. But yeah, Luke, you are welcome back any time you want. And yeast is always a popular subject around here. I mean, everything we do circles around that. So, you know.
Yeah. We're yeast rangers or yeast farmers or whatever.
Whatever we are, yeah. Well,
Yeast wranglers.
Yeast wranglers, yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's a subject that's near and dear, and honestly, I mean, we wouldn't have any of this without that. So we could go on and on and on about that, and I think we probably will end up doing exactly that. For those of you that are out there listening, while Luke and Pete and Ryan have been talking, I have been out there finding links and putting them on the episode page. There's like 15 links to scientific articles about fermentation and nitrogen uptake and all sorts of fun stuff. So get out there and do some reading. There's a lot of really good information. And, of course, the link to the Scott Labs catalog on fermentation as well. So lots of good info there.
Yeah, no, fantastic.
Yeah. And, Luke, I think what we'd like to do is maybe drag you back with one of your compatriots on the science side of the house, or rather, officially on the science side of the house, since obviously you're a sciencey sort of guy. But as you mentioned, that there's people that are like kind of neck deep in that science stuff, that we could bring in for the geeks amongst us, and God knows we've got our share. So, I was commenting
now.
Yeah.
If we did that, I would propose that we'd send you questions in advance so that instead of you trying to answer them on the fly, you can spend some time to get, not to say these weren't real answers, but I'm saying I know you would much prefer for us to give you some heads up before you just come on and taking pot shots.
Well, what I think we'll do is I'll start collecting questions, Luke, and then I'll coordinate with you and whoever you think would be another good person to come on and just kind of rope you guys in, and I'll load you up with questions ahead of time so that we can just kind of not, set them up and knock them down. Does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. And, the whole questions beforehand, this isn't the election, so, I'm good answering on the fly. There's my little jab. But anyways, about
right there
the next podcast, maybe we take all the questions that they have and we'll just answer them all. That's cool too. And beyond that, look, some of what I spoke about is, science, at least scientifically, not proven, but it's been around, right? It's pretty legit because science is never done. And some of it was philosophy on my part. Some of it was experience. Some of it's stuff I heard from other people. So the thing is, take things with a grain of salt. This is not the 100% truth and nothing but the truth. There's some opinion in there as well, and the science changes. So, don't hold me liable. And then, last but not least, I'm a salesperson. I work for Scott Laboratories. I will have to say that Scott Laboratories is much more than a yeast supplier. So, if there's anything that we can help with, we have all the things.
Yep.
It's really all the things.
Yeast and nutrients and measuring things, and like you said, they're distributors. So go check their catalog. They got a lot of stuff.
Well, and one thing to bear in mind too, for those people that are meaderies in planning or in transition already, is Scott Lab performs a number of invaluable tests at a really, really reasonable price. So if you want, different kinds of assays, different kinds of bacterial counts, or any kind of analysis you can think of, these guys can do it.
We can do just about anything, I think, or at least we'll go out trying. So, we want to be the resource, and we're happy to do so. And it's all in the pursuit of making the best product we can.
Cool. Well, just know that you've probably roped yourself in for like a regular Scott Labs episode thing going on. So, this is your fault later when they start yelling at you. We're just going to point to you and say, Luke started it.
Well, and here's the thing. My boss may listen to this, and I might not have a job, and so I'll be totally out of it. You'll never get me back.
We'll never get you back. I don't think so. Yeah, because there'll be a lot of...
We'll get you back. We'll get you back. You still have the knowledge. Even if you don't have a job.
Yeah, we'll just pimp you out there to the other yeast places. You won't have any problems. We'll get you fixed up.
I'll just tell you one
guys
thing,
are
though,
great.
Luke, for quick anecdotal things. My stack of fermentation handbooks from Scott Labs is second only to my stack of D&D books.
Oh, man, that's totally geek. That's bad, Pete.
Nice.
Scott Labs, the D&D of yeast.
There you go.
That's awesome.
Oh.
God.
Well, that's great. I've had a great time. Thank you very much. I'm honored.
Well, thanks for
look forward
coming
to
on,
doing it
man.
again.
Yeah, we appreciate it, and of
Yeah,
course you
yeah.
realize that now you are one of us, and we'll have to come to the conference, to MeadCon next year, and we'll drag you off to all the parties and everything that you may not have already had the chance to go to. Who knows?
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah,
Sounds like a plan.
Stick around next year.
Yeah,
We'll
Luke,
meet you up.
Yeah, we'll totally meet you up. No worries.
Yeah, I was just going to say I want to hook you up with some meads now. So how do I call Scott's Labs tomorrow to get
Yeah,
your phone
I'll give you
number?
Ryan. I'll connect you two on email, and you can trade information. And don't put that out there because then everybody's going to be hitting you up,
No.
Ryan, for Mead, and you have to give it all to me and Luke. So I'm just saying,
What about me?
Well, okay, and AJ, if you can figure out a way to get it across the border.
Nah.
Yeah,
She's up in Canada. Eh?
yeah, in Canada. Eh?
Yeah.
Technically,
Whereas-
you could send it to Ogdensburg. I have a passport. I can go pick it up
That's
myself
right.
now.
She now has a passport. She crossed the border with impunity. All right, Luke. Well, we'll let you get back. Even in Arkansas, it's getting kind of late, so we'll let you get on with
Yeah.
things, and we'll stay in touch, dude. I'll let you know what's going on, and we'll be bringing you and anybody else you think could be good to have on the show back.
Sounds great. Thank you guys so much. It was a pleasure.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Thanks
Thank
very
you,
much.
Thank you.
All right,
Great
take care.
information.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Susan.
totally.
Mhm.
Cool. Nice.
Thank you,
Night.
Mr. Pete.
Hey, happy to be on, man.
Yeah, anytime we
It's,
can lure you onto the show on a Tuesday night, I'm stunned, but thank you.
Yeah, I'm just taking some time off, and I'll be back to it next week.
Oh, yeah, that's true. So, well, I'm glad that we got the opportunity to have you on for a little bit anyway.
Definitely nice
Yeah.
to talk to you, Pete.
Yeah, it's always good
It's
to
the
have
same
you
here,
on.
AJ. Ryan, always a pleasure. Vicky and AJ, it's great to speak to you folks too. Great seeing you at the conference and the Mazer Cup. Had a great time just hanging out with you guys. So it's not that far away already.
I know, right? Sorry, I've already got people hitting me up going, so, are you guys taking speakers yet for the conference? Like, yeah, soon. Let me kind of get my people in place first. I gotta get my...
Let me recover from the last one.
Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah.
My voice is still
Take a
popping
chill
and
pill.
cracking from the last one, yeah. But no, that's good though. I'm happy to see the popularity of it. To see that people are already thinking about 2019, and
Yep.
MeadCon and Mazer Cup, and I think that is amazing. That that says a lot about the upswing in the interest in mead in general, and that makes me happy.
You there?
I wonder
Yep.
how many more years we have to go before the yeast companies start taking mead in a serious fashion, where they start to try to learn things for us.
They already
Well-
have started. There are several manufacturers that are tailoring yeasts for specifically mead. Not a lot of them, but it's starting to happen. It'll get better.
Well,
It's on the way.
Yeah. Once the dam breaks, it'll be crazy. There'll be a lot of that going on. I've got a dog sitting in my lap going, dude, really? You're like half an hour late and we have to, go to the bathroom. All right, so I'm going to let everybody get on with their lives, and we're going to wind it up for tonight because we're already, 45 minutes over time. And so just a few things coming up for y'all to look at. April 29th, Brothers Drake Mead in Ohio having their Waffle Palooza. It is both a charitable event and waffles and mead, so there's like no downside there. And so go check it out. Link on the show on the episode page. On May 5th, Bee Nectar's got their Springfest. If you have not been to a Bee Nectar Springfest, then you are totally missing out. I haven't been, but I live vicariously through my friends, and they all tell me it's pretty damn awesome, so you should check it out. And also on May 5th is the California Honey Festival. Big deal, folks. If you like honey, this is something, and you're anywhere near California, you really want to check this out. Yeah.
Go out and see Amina Harris.
And go out and see Amina Harris. Yeah, this is being put on
God, it's
by,
worth it just for that.
Yeah, this is being put on by the UC Davis Honey and Pollination Institute. It is a thing with a capital T. You need to see it. So, go check it out. Link on the episode page so you can go get your tickets. Jaden is going waffles and mead. Yeah, well, Gotta love it. If you want your event on Gotmead Live, let us know at gotmead@gotmead.com because, I'm getting tired of hunting this stuff down on my own. Y'all got stuff going on. Why don't you let me know? I'll talk about it.
Free advertising.
That's it.
Yeah, free advertising. What's wrong with you people? Anyway,
And one closing thought.
Yeah.
One closing thought. A maple bacon Belgian waffle with maple Tabasco syrup.
Oh,
I hate you, Pete.
MG. I'm okay. Really, don't make me drool in my microphone. I'll short it out. And Ralph agrees.
Time for me to go.
Yeah.
And Ralph is uncaged and he's attacking somebody, so I've got to
God,
go.
yeah. Well, you better go take care of that before he kills someone. The lawsuits.
We'll talk to you guys soon.
All right. Talk to you later,
Bye
Pete.
now.
Thanks for coming
Good night.
on. Okay, so for upcoming guests, next week on May 1st, May Day, we will be off. I am going to be going to see my daughter Samantha get invested with her Army captain's bars, and so I'll be up in Virginia, being a super proud parent. And
Go Sammy.
Yeah, go Sammy. I'm so proud of her, I can't even tell you. And of course, getting the opportunity to spend time with my daughter, son-in-law, and the grandbaby, So, which is, the sole reason why I keep walking this side of the of the dirt and everything, because grandchildren.
It's all good.
That's right. Yeah. So, but anyway, so we'll be off next week, but we'll be back the week after on 5/8. We have Billy Belts, and he is the owner of Lost Cause Meadery out in Southern California. So he hangs with Alex and the rest of the crowd in Southern California Mead Alliance. He has gotten out of the gate with a humongous bang, and he made some pretty amazing meads. So
yeah, one of his meads was the one that I couldn't stay away from. I didn't have seconds of any mead ever in the entire weekend, or in the entire week I was there, except for that one that was, what the heck was it? Pink peppercorn and
the
raspberries.
pink peppercorn. Yeah, oh my God.
Or pepper. No, I think it was pink. It was not pink peppercorn. But anyway, that one was just divine.
Yeah,
I went back 5 times.
We'll have to ask him about it when he comes on.
Oh.
Yeah. I gotta figure out a time frame in which I can go to Southern California and go hook back up with everybody there, because I went to the first meeting that the Alliance had, and they were so nice. Every one of them brought a bottle for me to try. So I got to it was cool because instead of having to traipse all over, San Diego and environs, which is quite a lot of traipsing, they all came to one place and I got to try all their meads at once. So that was pretty awesome. Or at least one of all their meads at once. But yeah, he's got good stuff, and I think we'll hear a lot from Billy. Billy is he knows a lot about making mead. He knows a lot about starting a meadery, and he knows a lot about marketing. He actually comes from a marketing background, so he has
that's cool.
Yeah, he has a lot of really good ideas. So I think it'll be a good conversation, and it'll range all over everywhere. So we'll see what happens. But in the meantime, y'all got next week off, and so gird your loins and get ready for the 8th, and we'll be back.
Gird them mightily.
That's right. So that's all I got for now. Is there any other things that looks like it's just you and me? Ryan dropped off. Is there anything else that we should let them know, or can we let them go?
I think we can let them go. I don't have anything.
Okie dokie then. We'll see y'all in 2 weeks. Same mead time, same mead channel. And have a good May Day. Try not to, take any wooden glasses of mead, unless they're really good mead, in which case it's okay.
Have 2 or 3 then.
Have 2 or 3 then, yeah. So, all right. Later days, y'all, and we'll see you on the 8th. Night.
Say goodnight, Vicky.
Hey, goodnight, Vicky. Say goodnight, AJ.
Good night, AJ.
All righty.